Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into the terrifying story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso, one of the most ruthless and feared figures in mafia history. This is not just a tale of crime and violence. It's a chilling look at a man who climbed to the very top of the underworld through sheer brutality, betrayal, and cold calculation. Over decades, Casso became a living nightmare, not just for his enemies, but for those closest to him. In this documentary, you'll witness how loyalty became a deadly game, how fear ruled the streets, and how one man's rise would ultimately bring about the unraveling of an empire. Stay with me as we uncover the dark truths behind Gaspipe's empire and how it all came crashing down. Chapter 1. Born into Blood. The story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso begins not in the shadows, but right in the heart of them, Brooklyn, New York, in the fall of 1942. America was at war overseas, but on the streets of South Brooklyn, a different war was being fought every day. The smell of coal smoke hung in the air. Rusted chain-link fences rattled in the wind. Italian immigrants lined the tenement stoops, men in wool coats speaking in hushed Sicilian and Neapolitan, their eyes sharp with secrets. It was in this world that a boy named Anthony was born, into a life already marked by whispers and blood. His father, Michael Casso, was a made man with the Genovese crime family. Not just a name in a book, but a foot soldier, a man who kept his head down and did what was asked. He worked as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn waterfront, but everyone in the neighborhood knew that was just a cover. The docks were mob territory, and the unions were run by men who wore suits to kill, not to negotiate. Young Anthony didn't have to look far to understand the rules of power. He lived them. He breathed them. Even as a child, Anthony was quiet, observant, calculating. There was something cold in his gaze, something that unnerved even the older boys on the block. He wasn't the type to shout or throw punches recklessly. If you crossed him, he'd wait. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. But he never forgot. That patience would serve him well. And that memory, it would turn him into a weapon. The nickname Gaspipe came early, and it stuck like tar. No one's entirely sure where it originated. Some say it was because he once used a length of gas pipe in a street fight. Others claim it was his weapon of choice during his early days in burglary crews. Whatever the truth, the name fit. It sounded industrial, brutal, like something made to crush bone. And Anthony Casso lived up to it in every way. By his teenage years, Casso was already involved with local mob-connected crews. He ran errands for bookmakers, acted as a lookout for burglaries, and gradually worked his way into more serious business. He never finished high school. He didn't need to. His education came in alleys, in back rooms, and in whispered meetings behind shuttered storefronts. He learned from men who had killed and walked away. Men who didn't flinch when blood hit the floor. And more importantly, he listened. The neighborhood taught him that power wasn't just about violence. It was about control, information, fear. He watched how men like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese moved, quietly, precisely. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their names did the talking for them. Casso admired that. He wasn't flashy. He didn't crave attention. He craved control. Total, unquestioned control. His first arrest came at 17. A botched robbery. He did his time in silence, learned how to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. He understood the value of reputation. The streets remembered who cracked under pressure and who stood tall. By the time he got out, he wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone to be watched, someone to be used. It wasn't long before he fell in with the Lucchese crime family. At the time, the Luccheses were run by Carmine Tremonti, a quiet, business-minded boss who preferred to stay under the radar. Casso's rise began slowly, under the wing of powerful mentors. He worked with skilled burglars who trained him in the art of precision theft, jobs that required planning, stealth, and nerves of steel. He wasn't reckless. He didn't brag. And he didn't leave behind witnesses. That made him valuable, but it wasn't just skill that got him noticed. It was what he was willing to do. Casso had a ruthless streak that terrified even seasoned wise guys. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. When a job called for violence, He delivered it with surgical efficiency. And when it didn't, he waited, calculated. That cold, emotionless precision made him indispensable. And it made him dangerous. In the late 1960s, as the mafia landscape shifted, Casso's position within the Lucchese family solidified. He was trusted with sensitive assignments, enforcing debts, eliminating loose ends, collecting tribute. He understood the economy of fear better than most. Where other mobsters used brute force, Casso used a scalpel. He'd let a man live just long enough to spread the message. And when he did kill, it was final, efficient, forgotten by him, but not by the families left behind. By the early 1970s, the mafia was deep into drugs, despite long-standing rules against it. Casso was no exception. He became involved in heroin trafficking, working closely with some of the most violent crews in the city. The profits were massive, the risks even greater. But Casso thrived in that chaos. He knew how to insulate himself, how to keep one layer removed from the filth while still pulling every string. He was no street thug. He was something else, something colder. Violence followed him like a shadow. Friends disappeared. Rivals died in alleyways or were found floating near the docks. And yet, Casso kept rising, kept smiling. The blood never seemed to stick to him. To the public, he was a businessman, quiet, respectable. To the underworld, he was becoming something more, a problem solver, a man you called when you needed a job done with no questions asked, and no mistakes made. But underneath that calm exterior, something darker brewed. Casso didn't just use violence, he enjoyed it. Not openly, but privately. He would study his victims, learn their habits, their weaknesses. He treated murder like craft, like architecture. It wasn't enough to eliminate a threat. He wanted to own the fear, to hold it in his hand and watch it squirm. One former associate later recalled that Casso didn't blink when discussing murder. He could describe a killing over dinner like others might talk about the weather. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just the mechanics of death, the logistics, the angles, and the message. He had no illusions about honor. Casso didn't believe in the old codes, the romanticized notions of loyalty or family. To him, the mafia was about power, money, survival. And if someone got in the way of that, friend, enemy, or even blood, they had to go. He wasn't emotional. He was practical, efficient, lethal. As the 1980s loomed, Casso was no longer a soldier in the ranks. He was a rising force within the Lucchese family, a trusted lieutenant, a killer with a Rolodex. He had earned the respect of bosses and the fear of rivals. But most importantly, he had earned freedom. The freedom to move, to kill, to act without question. He was the man who didn't need to explain himself, who didn't answer to anyone unless he chose to. And with every passing year, his influence grew, quietly, methodically, like a storm, building far offshore. Yet, for all his control, all his calculation, Anthony Casso was still a man haunted by shadows. Not the shadows behind him, but the ones ahead. Because in the world he built, where trust was weakness and power meant blood, there was no finish line. Only the next target, the next betrayal, the next body. And in that world, even a man like Gaspipe, who rose from the gutters of Brooklyn to the highest circles of mafia power, could never outrun what he helped create. He was born into blood, and blood would follow him until the very end. Chapter 2. The Making of a Killer. Before Anthony Gaspipe Casso became one of the most feared figures in organized crime. Before his name became a whispered warning on the streets of New York, he was a young man in Brooklyn with a lockpick in one hand and ambition in the other. The 1950s and 60s were the golden years of the American Mafia, and in South Brooklyn, opportunity didn't come with a resume. It came with nerve. For Casso, crime was not a descent. It was a design, a deliberate path he chose to walk, one job at a time, one door at a time, until eventually, he no longer needed a door. He would be the one kicking them in. His earliest ventures into organized crime were shaped by his role in highly skilled burglary crews. This wasn't stick-up work or petty theft. These were surgical strikes. Banks, jewelry stores, high-end targets. Casso joined up with crews that didn't waste time with recklessness. They studied alarm systems, security rotations, and vault structures. Some of them had connections inside. These weren't thugs, they were tacticians. And Casso, quiet and methodical, fit right in. He wasn't flashy. He didn't draw attention. He just got the job done. And that, in the underworld, is the first rule of survival. He earned his stripes under seasoned criminals who recognized something in him early on, something colder than most. He didn't panic under pressure. He didn't hesitate when the stakes rose. And most importantly, he didn't talk. Loyalty in the mafia is a performance art, but Casso's silence wasn't just strategic, it was natural. He wasn't afraid of jail. He was afraid of irrelevance that he moved with confidence, always one step ahead of law enforcement and rivals alike. With every successful heist, his reputation grew, not just as a thief, but as someone who could be trusted with sensitive work. Eventually, that work began to change. The targets weren't just safes or vaults anymore. They were people. That Casso's first murder wasn't the heat-of-the-moment act of a nervous kid trying to prove himself. It was planned, measured, approved. The target had crossed the wrong people, violated rules that couldn't be forgiven. A warning needed to be sent, and Casso, still in his 20s, volunteered. The hit went off without a hitch. A clean kill. No witnesses. No mistakes. When asked afterward how it felt, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes did the talking. Cold. Unbothered. Focused. It was the beginning of something irreversible. Word spread quickly within the Lucchese family. Casso wasn't just another street guy looking for a shortcut to power. He was different. He was disciplined, detached, and deadly. That combination made him invaluable. He could be trusted not only to carry out violence, but to do so with the kind of discretion that kept bosses out of courtrooms. And in the mafia, that's the currency that matters most. As the 1970s progressed, Casso became a quiet presence behind more and more acts of violence. Some were sanctioned by higher-ups. Others, he initiated himself. Whether the reasons were business, betrayal, or payback, Casso understood that the line between executioner and executive was razor-thin in the world he occupied. Power didn't come from meetings, it came from memory. Who had the guts to act? Who had the guts to finish? And Casso finished everything he started. He wasn't impulsive. That's what terrified people most. He didn't yell. He didn't boast. When Casso entered a room, he carried silence like a weapon. He observed, calculated, listened. And if you'd wronged him, or someone he served, you were already gone. You just didn't know it yet. One associate would later describe him as the kind of guy who would shoot you in the head and then help your mother carry groceries an hour later. That wasn't hyperbole. Casso knew how to disappear into the scenery, how to show up clean while others were still wiping blood from their hands. That skill allowed him to operate at a level that few mobsters ever reached. He wasn't a hothead. He was a ghost with a trigger finger, but violence wasn't just an end for Casso, it was a tool, a currency he traded in with precision. He used it not only to eliminate threats, but to establish himself as a problem solver. If someone needed to be silenced, he made sure they stayed that way. If a message needed to be sent, it arrived soaked in fear. He began to handle the kinds of jobs others wouldn't touch, not because he was reckless, but because he didn't flinch. And more importantly, he didn't miss. His methods became increasingly refined. One target, a man suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, disappeared without a trace. No body, no noise, just gone. Another, a rival crew member who'd crossed. A Lucchese captain was found in a vacant lot with 5 bullets in his chest and no clues for the police to follow. These weren't crimes of passion. They were executions, clean, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. Over time, Casso became one of the few men trusted to handle high-value hits without oversight. His relationship with Vicamuzzo, another rising star within the Lucchese family, only added to his influence. The two shared not only ambition, but temperament. They were cold, calculating, and paranoid. It was a bond built on mutual respect and mutual fear. Together, they formed a formidable alliance. Casso the tactician, Amuzzo the enforcer. By the early 1980s, They were involved in everything from extortion to drug trafficking, and the trail of bodies behind them was growing longer by the month. But unlike many of their peers, they didn't seek publicity. They sought results. And in the underworld, results often meant blood. Casso's transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a weapon, a man who spoke softly and carried a kill list. His apartment in Brooklyn was modest, nondescript. His routines were careful. He drove his own car, avoided flashy restaurants, and never carried a beeper, a rarity in that era. Every move was calculated, every risk assessed. But beneath that calm surface, the body count rose. He began ordering hits with increasing frequency, not just against enemies, but against anyone who threatened the delicate power balance he and Amuso had built. Informants, unreliable associates, even fellow mobsters who showed signs of disloyalty. Casso believed that fear was more reliable than loyalty, and he had no tolerance for mistakes. He once told a fellow mobster, "You only get to betray me once." And he meant it. At by the mid-1980s, law enforcement had started to notice a pattern. Murders with no witnesses. Crews that vanished. Overnight, a sudden rise in disappearances across Brooklyn and Staten Island. The NYPD suspected internal mob warfare, but no one had names. No one had evidence. The streets were going quiet, and behind that silence, Casso was watching everything. His precision and brutality earned him nicknames even among hardened criminals. The doctor, the technician, and of course, the one that stuck, Gaspipe. To Casso, it wasn't just a moniker. It was a mask, a way to separate the man from the myth. The myth could kill without guilt. The man could sleep afterward. That mask allowed him to keep rising, to keep orchestrating the kind of violence that would have made earlier generations of mobsters uneasy. The old guard still clung to ideas of honor. Casso had no such illusions. He wasn't interested in omerta for tradition's sake. He believed in silence because it worked. He believed in murder because it solved problems. He once said that if he had 100 lives to take, he'd take them all again. And no one who knew him doubted it. But even in those early years, there were cracks in the armor. Associates began to talk behind closed doors. Some feared he was too quick to kill. Others whispered that he enjoyed it too much, that he didn't just use violence, he needed it. Like air, like water, a craving that couldn't be contained forever. Still, no one challenged him. Not yet, because to challenge Casso was to disappear, to be erased. By the time the FBI began piecing together the extent of his work, it was too late. The murders had already been done, the witnesses silenced, the evidence buried. Anthony Casso had evolved from a young thief on the streets of Brooklyn into something much darker. A man who could smile while signing your death warrant. A killer who saw no difference between business and blood. And the most terrifying part? He was just getting started. Chapter 3. Blood Brothers. Amuso and Casso. By the early 1980s, Anthony Gaspipe Casso was already known in the underworld as a cold, efficient killer. He had earned his reputation through quiet obedience and ruthless precision. But power in the mafia isn't built alone. It requires allies, partners, someone to share the blood and the burden. That someone was Vittorio Vic Amuso. Together, they would form one of the most dangerous duos in the history of organized crime. Bound by violence, driven by ambition, and united by fear, their partnership would reshape the Lucchese crime family and soak its name in blood. Vic Amuso was everything the mafia feared and admired in one man. Short-tempered, cunning, calculated. He had grown up in Brooklyn's East New York, a war zone of its own, and like Casso, had risen from the streets through violence and loyalty. He was a street-level enforcer who became known for his sharp instincts and brutal efficiency. By the late 1970s, he had already climbed to the rank of capo in the Lucchese family, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew exactly how to rise further. He just needed the right partner. When Amuso and Casso's paths crossed, something clicked. It wasn't just respect. It was recognition. They saw in each other the same quiet hunger, the same comfort with bloodshed, the same cold, unflinching approach to power. They didn't just get along, they moved in sync. Where one spoke, the other listened. Where one hesitated, the other pulled the trigger. In a world filled with betrayal and paranoia, their bond was rare. And it was lethal, their first major. Collaboration came during a period of rising tension within the Lucchese hierarchy. The family was led at the time by Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a boss known for his low profile and sharp mind. Corallo saw promise in both men, especially in their ability to carry out sensitive work without drawing heat. But more than that, he recognized the value of fear. And no one instilled fear quite like Amuso and Casso. Under Corallo's rule, Amuso and Casso were given greater responsibilities. They ran rackets, controlled unions, and oversaw crews in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Casso became Amuso's chief enforcer, his most trusted hand. If Amuso needed someone silenced, Casso didn't ask questions. He simply made sure that silence was permanent. And as their influence grew, so did their ambition. When the commission case of 1986 landed Corallo in prison, the Lucchese throne was suddenly vacant. The Mafia Commission, the ruling council of New York's 5 families, needed a new leader for the Luccheses. From prison, Corallo gave his blessing to Amuso. And just like that, Vic became the boss. His rise to power wasn't democratic. It was orchestrated, swift, and backed by fear. And standing right beside him, ready to carry out his orders, was Gaspipe Casso. Amuso's promotion marked a turning point for the Lucchese family. The quiet, calculated leadership of Corallo gave way to something darker, more volatile. Under Amuso and Casso, the family transformed into a regime fueled by suspicion and governed by execution. Paranoia became policy. Trust was a weakness. Loyalty was proven only in blood. Casso, now the underboss, took full control of enforcement. He ran hit squads like a general, issuing orders from the shadows and keeping his fingerprints off everything. Dozens of murders were carried out during this period, some of them targeted, others indiscriminate. It didn't matter if you were made or not. If Casso felt you were a threat, you were gone. Their tactics were cruel and merciless. One man suspected of skimming money from a Lucchese-run union was tortured for hours before being killed and buried in a remote lot. Another associate who had simply questioned a business decision was lured into a meeting, shot in the face, and left in the trunk of a car. The message was clear. There would be no dissent, no disobedience, and no second chances. What made their partnership so deadly wasn't just the violence. It was the efficiency. Amuso trusted Casso implicitly. He didn't need to oversee every move. He let Gaspipe operate with autonomy, knowing the results would be clean, final, and effective. Casso, in turn, respected Amuso's strategic mind. He understood that power required structure, and that Amuso's vision for the family, however brutal, was rooted in control. But even within the mafia, there are lines. And Amuso and Casso didn't just cross them, they erased them. They began killing their own men at an alarming rate. Entire crews disappeared. Veterans of the family, men who had served loyally for decades, were executed for minor infractions or vague suspicions. The Lucchese family became a place where no one felt safe, not even made men. Especially not made men. Fear kept the wheels turning. But fear, when used carelessly, corrodes. Soldiers began to distrust one another. Associates stopped attending meetings. Some started secretly cooperating with law enforcement, not out of conscience, but out of survival. The FBI, long struggling to penetrate the upper ranks of the mafia, suddenly found doors opening. The blood trail left behind by Amuso and Casso had made loyalty a gamble no one could afford to lose. Still, the murders continued. In 1988, the infamous Windows case brought additional heat. A lucrative scheme involving mafia-controlled window replacement contracts across New York City had connected all 5 families. The profits were astronomical, but so was the exposure. Federal prosecutors began circling. Witnesses were flipped. Indictments were issued. Amuso and Casso knew they were being watched, but they didn't slow down. If anything, they doubled down. During this period, Casso authorized the murder of Bruno Facciolo, a Lucchese soldier suspected of cooperating with authorities. Facciolo was found in the trunk of his car, shot multiple times, his mouth stuffed. With a dead canary, a mob message with centuries of history. Rat. It wasn't just a hit. It was theater, terror as a language. But the real turning point, the moment their partnership would leave a permanent scar on the Mafia, came when Casso enlisted two NYPD detectives, Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, as paid assassins and informants. They weren't just leaking police files. They were pulling triggers. Known as the Mafia Cops, the pair carried out hits on Casso's behalf, used department intel to track targets, and helped him evade law enforcement. This move wasn't just bold. It was unprecedented. Casso had weaponized the law itself. For a while, it worked brilliantly. Enemies vanished before they could speak. Investigations stalled. Warrants mysteriously failed to materialize. The web of protection around Amuso and Casso grew tighter. But so did the news that by the early 1990s, federal agents had begun putting the pieces together. Informants whispered names. Paper trails emerged. The murder count was too high, the patterns too sharp. Casso and Amuso were indicted on multiple charges, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. And when the pressure reached its peak, they did what few mafia bosses ever dared. They ran. The manhunt was nationwide. Both men went underground, using safe houses, burner phones, and an intricate network of loyalists to stay hidden. But they couldn't run forever. In 1991, Amuso was caught in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was arrested without a fight, his reign over in an instant. Casso, ever the survivor, managed to elude capture for another year. But in 1993, he too was arrested in New Jersey, his luck finally running out. Their fall was as sudden as their rise was violent. The partnership that had ruled with such absolute terror collapsed in silence. Amuso refused to cooperate. He would serve life in prison. Casso, on the other hand, made a shocking decision, one that would shake the mafia to its core. He flipped, but that chapter would come later. For now, what mattered was the blood, the legacy, the scorched earth left behind by two men who trusted no one but each other. Their bond had built an empire, but it had also sown the seeds of its destruction. Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso weren't visionaries. They weren't reformers or businessmen. They were killers, efficient, merciless, bound not by ideals, but by necessity. In a world that preached loyalty, they weaponized betrayal. In a family built on tradition, they ruled with chaos. And in doing so, they didn't just lead the Lucchese family, they nearly destroyed it. Blood was their language, brotherhood their mask. And behind that mask, nothing but shadows. Chapter 4. Gaspipe's reputation. Feared, not loved. In the world of organized crime, respect is currency. It's earned in blood, measured by silence, and passed hand to hand through whispered stories. But Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso never sought respect in the traditional sense. He didn't crave admiration. He didn't demand loyalty through charisma or charm. What he built instead was something far more enduring and far more dangerous. He built fear. Cold, calculated, paralyzing fear. And in a world ruled by killers, it was fear that made him untouchable. By the mid-1980s, Casso had moved beyond the shadows of the street. He was no longer just a soldier or even just an underboss. He was a name that caused conversations to stop. A ghost whose presence was felt even when he wasn't in the room. His reputation didn't rely on rumors. It was carved into the concrete of Brooklyn, etched into the memory of every wise guy who had seen what happened when Gaspipe didn't like you. He wasn't a man you got to know. He was a name you didn't say unless you had to. Among the 5 families of New York, violence was a constant. Men died for money, for territory, for violating codes written in blood. But even in that savage landscape, Casso stood apart. He killed with purpose, but without pause. He didn't need to yell or threaten or wave a gun around. If you crossed a line, you disappeared. No second chances. No warnings. No exceptions. The Lucchese family under Vic Amuso may have been ruled by fear, but it was Casso who wielded it like a blade. He was the one who kept lists in his head, Names, faces, grudges. He remembered who spoke out of turn, who hesitated to follow orders, who complained about the money. To most mobsters, those things were nuisances. To Casso, they were crimes. Punishable by death, he didn't enjoy chaos. He engineered it. Every killing served a function, whether it was eliminating a threat or sending a message. He was meticulous. He studied the routines of his targets, where they ate, who they trusted, what time they came home. He didn't shoot from the hip. He struck from the dark. That it wasn't long before his methods became legendary. Wise guys who had spent decades in the life, men who'd survived prison, turf wars, and federal indictments, spoke of him with hushed voices. Some called him a butcher, others a genius. Most didn't call him anything at all, because in the world of Gaspipe Casso, attention was a liability, and speaking his name could get you killed. Even his friends weren't safe. One moment of doubt, one slip of the tongue, and you were on the list. He didn't draw lines between enemies and allies. Everyone was a potential threat. He believed that trust was a fantasy, that loyalty faded the moment it was tested. So, he didn't wait to be betrayed. He acted first, and in the process, he created a climate of fear so intense that soldiers stopped asking questions. Captains avoided meetings, and associates looked over their shoulders just walking down the street. There was no warmth in his leadership, no camaraderie, just results. That's what made him so effective and so feared. He wasn't loved. He wasn't even liked. But he was obeyed. Without hesitation, Casso's reputation was built not just on what he did, but how he did it. He didn't grandstand. He didn't make shows of violence. Most of the time, the bodies were found alone, cold, left in alleys or burned out cars. Sometimes they weren't found at all. There were no arguments. No last words. Just silence. Point 1. Murder in particular sent shockwaves through the underworld. A Lucchese associate had been suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. Casso had him lured to a meeting under the guise of resolving a dispute. The man arrived thinking it would be a conversation. Instead, he was shot in the head, wrapped in plastic, and dumped into the Atlantic. No one mourned him. No one dared. That was the point. Gaspipe wasn't theatrical, but he understood the theater of violence. The spectacle mattered. He once had a man's body stuffed into a trunk, his mouth gagged with a dead canary. The symbolism was ancient, rat. It was a message to anyone even thinking about cooperating with the government. And it worked. Informants dried up. Testimony vanished. Casso's silence spread like a plague. He ruled with a paranoia that became policy. He planted seeds of distrust within his own crews, forcing men to report on each other. He rewarded suspicion, encouraged division. No one knew who was watching whom. That atmosphere destroyed bonds, fractured loyalty, and left him as the only figure everyone feared more than the law. And yet, behind the violence, there was calculation. He didn't kill randomly. Every murder was an investment, a removal of risk, a tightening of control. His paranoia may have seemed irrational, but in the violent, backstabbing world of the mafia, it made sense. He believed everyone would turn eventually, so he turned on them first. Even federal agents came to understand his methods. They studied the murders, the patterns. They knew that if Casso wanted someone dead, it was already done. He didn't bluff. He didn't negotiate. And when he did speak, his words were clipped, precise, like everything else about him. There was no poetry to his violence, just efficiency. The fear he created reached beyond the Lucchese family. Other bosses were wary of him. He was too violent, too unpredictable, too quick to kill. But they couldn't deny his results. Under his and Amuso's rule, the Lucchese family became leaner, more disciplined, and, at least for a time, more profitable. Territories expanded. Rackets grew. Tribute flowed up the chain without delay. Because no one wanted to be on Casso's bad side, or his radar at all. But fear is a double-edged sword. It commands obedience, but it breeds resentment. The more people Casso eliminated, the fewer remained who trusted him. Captains began second-guessing their orders. Associates started keeping records, hedging their bets. Some even began reaching out to federal agents, not to confess, but to prepare, just in case. Because they knew that in Gaspipe's world, the only thing more dangerous than betrayal was hesitation. His name became synonymous with death, not just among his enemies, but among his own. If Gaspipe called you in for a meeting, you didn't sleep the night before. If he asked to see you alone, you made peace with your sins. That was the climate he created, one in which survival meant total submission, and even then, the odds weren't good. One federal prosecutor later described Casso as the most frightening individual he'd ever encountered. Not because of his appearance, not because of his voice, but because of his eyes. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just calculation. Like a machine designed to destroy threats. That he wasn't driven by money. He had plenty of that. He wasn't driven by fame. He avoided the spotlight. What drove him was control, the ability to shape outcomes, silence opposition, and erase problems. He didn't need applause. He just needed obedience. But control built on fear doesn't last forever. It cracks. It erodes. And by the early 1990s, those cracks were beginning to show. Associates once loyal began to vanish. Not by Casso's hand, but by their own choice. They ran, hid, some even flipped. Not because they hated him, but because they feared he'd kill them anyway. The silence he relied on had become too deafening. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Casso never blinked. He never changed course. He believed in fear until the very end. Even after his arrest, when facing multiple life sentences, he carried himself with the same quiet menace. He tried to maintain control, even in a prison cell. But fear, once it's broken, doesn't come back. That he had ruled through terror, built a name that made grown men tremble. But the same fear that had elevated him would eventually isolate him. No one came to his defense. No one vouched for him. He had killed too many, betrayed too often. He was powerful, but utterly alone. Anthony Gaspipe Casso's rise was not a story of charm or loyalty. It was a reign of calculated violence, a path paved in silence and soaked in blood. He was not loved. He didn't care to be. He was feared, and that, for a time, was enough. But in the end, even fear has a shelf life, and when it fades, all that's left is the body count. Chapter 5. The Mob's Secret Weapon. The contractor of death, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, had already carved out a reputation that sent chills through New York's criminal underworld. But what made him truly different, what made him indispensable, was not just the number of bodies he left in his wake, but the breadth of his reach. By the late 1980s, he was no longer just a killer for the Lucchese family. He had become something more dangerous, something rarer, a resource, a tool, a weapon for hire. While most mafia figures stayed within the confines of their own crime families, Casso became a freelance executioner, an enforcer whose services could be quietly borrowed, discreetly summoned. The other families knew what he could do, and more importantly, they knew that if they paid the price, Gaspipe could make a problem disappear. In the rigid hierarchy of the mafia, such arrangements were rare and always unspoken. But Casso operated above traditional boundaries. He didn't need formal approval. His reputation traveled ahead of him. When bosses from the Genovese or Bonanno families found themselves with a sensitive issue, a rogue soldier, a suspected informant, a debt left unpaid, they didn't send their own men. They sent word to Gaspipe. He understood the rules of discretion. These weren't favor trades. These were contracts. Efficient, silent, final. No loose ends. No questions. The killings were billed as internal cleanups or favor returns. But everyone knew what was really happening. Casso was the mafia's secret weapon, a ghost with a gun whose loyalty wasn't bound by blood, but by the cold logic of usefulness. And that usefulness grew with every hit. He didn't just kill targets, he erased them. Bodies were dumped in rivers, buried in construction lots, or simply never found. Victims were often lured in with a handshake and left with nothing. His style was unmistakable, clean, swift, clinical. It wasn't violence for its own sake. It was death as a service. A message without a signature point. One of his most chilling talents was his ability to anticipate danger before it formed. He didn't just take out those who had flipped, He took out those he suspected might. To him, hesitation was a warning sign. A pause in conversation could mean a future betrayal. And when he sensed that hesitation, he struck first. That foresight made him invaluable to bosses too cautious to move on their own suspicions. They didn't have to be certain. Casso would decide for them. Among his most infamous contract killings was the elimination of a Bonanno associate suspected of cooperating with the FBI. The man had been on the radar for months, but internal politics prevented the Bonannos from acting swiftly, so they outsourced it. Casso handled the job in less than 48 hours. The associate vanished. No body, no noise, only silence. That silence became Casso's signature. As his services expanded, so did his network. Casso wasn't working alone. He had a crew of loyal men, each trained in the art of discretion. They carried out his orders with the same brutal efficiency he demanded of himself. And if they faltered, they were replaced. Permanently. There were no second chances in Casso's world. That was the price of working for a man who answered only to death. It wasn't just mob bosses who came to him. Lower-ranking soldiers, captains, even corrupt union leaders sought his help. If you had enough money or enough leverage, Casso could be persuaded to intervene. He was selective, but not untouchable. He weighed the risk, measured the benefit, and made the call. Sometimes the price was cash. Other times it was favors, influence, or information. But whatever the cost, the payment was always followed by blood. And still, he remained in the shadows. Unlike the flamboyant gangsters who craved the spotlight, Casso avoided cameras, avoided headlines. He didn't flaunt his power. He concealed it. That made him even more terrifying. He was the figure no one saw coming. The one who didn't warn, didn't threaten, just acted. He didn't build empires. He cleaned them. Brutally. Quietly. Permanently. His role as a contractor blurred the lines between the five families. In a world defined by tribalism and tradition, Casso operated with a kind of rogue autonomy. But no one dared question it. Not even the commission. Because as dangerous as he served a purpose. He was the wolf they unleashed when things got out of control. And as long as the killings stayed quiet, as long as the money kept flowing, no one wanted to stop him. What made Casso even more effective was his corruption pipeline. Through years of calculated relationships, he had built an intricate web of law enforcement contacts, cops, clerks, and even federal agents who fed him information. Case files, surveillance targets, grand jury leaks. With every favor, he tightened his grip on the system. He knew who was being watched. He knew when raids were coming. He knew who was flipping before their own crews did. This intelligence allowed him to stay one step ahead, both in murder and in survival. It was how he kept himself and his allies out of prison, and how he identified those who couldn't be saved. For those men, there was no warning, no negotiation, only the inevitable tap on the shoulder. The moment the lights went out, that was how Casso worked. From the inside, with precision. One of his most controversial hits was that of a Gambino captain involved in a business dispute that threatened to spill into public view. Rather than escalate the feud, the Gambinos quietly sent a message through intermediaries. Casso took the contract, carried it out himself, and made it look like a robbery gone wrong. No links, no arrests, just another statistic on the nightly news. His ability to mask killings as accidents or unrelated street crimes became an art form. He paid off pathologists, intimidated witnesses, and manipulated crime scenes with chilling accuracy. His murders didn't just remove people. They erased them. At the peak of his power, Casso had orchestrated or directly participated in over 30 murders, though some sources say the real number was far higher. Each killing a solution, each body a message. And every time, his name stayed hidden. The bosses whispered, the soldiers obeyed, and the public never knew. Yet even among murderers, there were limits. Lines that most wouldn't cross. Casso didn't see those lines. He saw only threats and opportunities. When he enlisted the help of two corrupt NYPD detectives, Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, it marked a disturbing new chapter. The so-called mafia cops weren't just informants. They were participants. They tracked targets, provided addresses, and in some cases, they pulled the trigger themselves. Casso had now weaponized the very institution designed to bring him down. It was a masterstroke of corruption. For a price, he had turned the badge into a tool of murder. And for years, it worked. People died. Files disappeared. Witnesses never made it to court. He had turned the system against itself. But the more effective he became, the more feared he grew. And the more feared he grew, the more isolated he became. Those who once whispered admiration began to whisper warnings. Don't get too close to Gaspipe, they'd say. You don't know where the line is until it's too late. Even Amuso, his partner in power, began to question his reach. The very autonomy that made Casso powerful also made him dangerous. To his own, he wasn't controllable. He wasn't predictable. He answered to no one, not even the boss. That autonomy would come at a cost. As federal pressure intensified and indictments began to sweep through the ranks, the same families that had once employed Casso's services began to distance themselves. They couldn't afford to be tied to his trail of bodies, couldn't risk their names surfacing in grand jury testimony. The weapon they had once relied on was now a liability, and Casso could feel the shift. The calls stopped coming. The meetings dried up. The alliances frayed. The walls were closing in. He had built a career on eliminating threats, but now he was the threat, and there was no one left to protect him. Still, he didn't flinch. He never begged, never backed down. He kept moving, kept watching. He believed that fear was still enough, that the legend of Gaspipe would shield him one more time. But the silence he had used to control the streets had become his own. The job stopped. The protection vanished. And the man once known as the Mafia's most valuable killer found himself alone. Anthony Casso had become the ultimate contractor of death, a man who blurred family lines, corrupted the law, and built an empire of silence. But in the end, even silence has its echo. Even fear begins to crack. And the blood that had bought him power now marked the path to his fall. Chapter 6. The 1980s Mafia Wars. The 1980s were a crucible, a decade that forged legends, shattered alliances, and redrew the map of organized crime in New York City. For Anthony Gaspipe Casso, it was the era that defined his infamy, the period where violence became not just a tool, but a weapon of war. The simmering tensions between the five families, once held in fragile balance by unspoken codes and whispered agreements, erupted into brutal, bloody conflict. Casso was not merely a participant. He was a catalyst, an architect of chaos whose fingerprints stained every major hit, every betrayal, every power grab. This was the decade when the Mafia's old order cracked, and in its place, a reign of terror was born. The backdrop to these wars was a shifting landscape of ambition and distrust. The Commission, the governing council of the five families, was no longer a placid sea. It had become a battlefield. Leaders jostled for control. Crews turned on one another. Loyalties fractured like glass. And Gaspipe Casso, rising swiftly through the ranks, thrived in this new world. His reputation for cold-blooded efficiency made him a sought-after enforcer, a man whose orders were final and whose threats were never idle. The war within the Lucchese family itself was one of the most violent. After Vic Amuso ascended to boss in the mid-1980s, with Casso as his underboss and chief executioner, the family was plunged into internal conflict. Old guard members, those who had survived decades of the Mafia's machinations, were purged ruthlessly. Suspected informants, traitors, and anyone deemed disloyal were marked for death. Casso's hit squads operated with brutal precision, turning the Lucchese family into a house divided by fear. But the bloodshed wasn't confined to internal family politics. Across the city, the traditional balance of power between the five families was breaking down. The Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, Colombo, and Lucchese families found themselves locked in territorial disputes and economic battles, each vying for control over lucrative rackets, drug trafficking, extortion, construction, and unions. The old rules of engagement were discarded, replaced by a new doctrine: kill first, ask questions later. Casso was the embodiment of this doctrine. His role extended beyond the Lucchese family. He was a hired gun for any faction willing to pay, or any ally in need of a brutal solution. His influence permeated the underworld, a web of violence and fear that ensnared even the most hardened criminals. Murders were no longer mere reprisals. They were strategic moves in a deadly chess game. Each killing reshaping alliances and power structures. One of the most notorious episodes of the decade was the so-called Windows case, a massive conspiracy involving the control of window replacement contracts across New York City. This racket, involving all 5 families, was worth millions, but it also brought unprecedented federal scrutiny. The case ignited tensions as families accused one another of skimming profits and double-crossing partners. Casso's role in this conflict was pivotal. He orchestrated hits to eliminate suspected informants and competitors, ensuring Lucchese dominance. The hit list grew longer. Names of made men, soldiers, and outsiders alike were crossed off with increasing frequency. Casso's crews carried out these murders with chilling efficiency. Ambushes in parking lots, executions in quiet streets, bodies found in rivers or abandoned lots. Each death was a calculated move, designed to send a message as much as to remove a threat. Fear was the language they spoke, and Casso was its most fluent orator. Alliances were tested under the pressure of this violence. Some families attempted to broker truces, but the blood spilled was too fresh, the wounds too deep. Old loyalties dissolved, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Betrayals multiplied. Informants emerged from the shadows, driven by self-preservation or revenge. The Mafia's code of silence, omerta, was cracking under the weight of endless killing. Casso was not immune to the shifting tides. As his power grew, so did the enemies he made, not only among rival families, but within his own ranks. His paranoia deepened. He ordered hits on anyone who showed signs of wavering loyalty, no matter their history or status. Entire crews vanished overnight. Ambushes were common. No one was safe, not even those closest to him. One chilling example was the murder of a Lucchese capo suspected of negotiating behind Amuso and Casso's backs. The man disappeared during a meeting, never to be seen again. His body was never recovered, but the message was clear: disloyalty would be met with permanent silence. Such acts instilled obedience, but also bred fear that spiraled into chaos. Federal law enforcement agencies struggled to keep pace with the escalating violence. The FBI, NYPD, and federal prosecutors launched task forces dedicated to penetrating the Mafia's ranks. But the web of corruption and intimidation made investigations perilous. Witnesses were scarce. Those who did come forward often disappeared or recanted under threat. Casso's strategic use of corrupted police officers and informants gave him a shield of protection, allowing him to operate with relative impunity for years. The war also forced the Mafia into new, darker strategies. Traditional hits gave way to more clandestine assassinations. Poisonings, staged accidents, and carefully planned ambushes became common. Casso's influence in these operations was profound. He trained his crews not just to kill, but to erase. To leave no evidence, no witnesses, and no trails. This elevated the violence from street-level crime to a sophisticated campaign of terror. Yet, amidst the bloodshed, there were moments that revealed the human cost. Families shattered, children orphaned, communities living under the constant threat of violence. For those caught in the crossfire, the Mafia wars were not a game of power, but a nightmare. Survivors spoke of sleepless nights, of looking over their shoulders, of the silence after a hit that felt louder than any scream. Within the families, the toll was equally heavy. Men who had dedicated their lives to the Mafia found themselves marked as targets. Trust was a rare commodity. Friendships dissolved into suspicion. The very fabric of the organized crime world began to unravel from within. Casso himself was both hunter and hunted. His growing list of enemies made every day a gamble. He fortified his safe houses, changed routines, and surrounded himself with the most loyal and most ruthless soldiers. Yet, No amount of caution could erase the trails of blood that led back to him. By the late 1980s, the Mafia wars had transformed New York's underworld. The violence reshaped power structures, toppled bosses, and set the stage for the eventual federal crackdown that would decimate the families in the 1990s. But at the heart of this storm stood Anthony Gaspipe Casso, a man whose name was synonymous with brutality, whose actions rewrote the rules of the game, and whose legacy would haunt the city long after the guns fell silent. The wars of the 1980s were not just battles for territory or money, they were battles for survival. And in those battles, Casso was both weapon and architect. His legacy was carved in blood, etched into the very streets he ruled with terror. The city would never forget the decade when the Mafia wars turned into a bloodbath. And neither would the men who survived it. Chapter 7. Enter the corrupt cops. In the labyrinth of organized crime, trust is currency, and betrayal is a weapon sharper than any knife. But what happens when the very people sworn to uphold the law become its deadliest adversaries? In the saga of Anthony Gaspipe Casso, this terrifying question found its answer in two unlikely figures: Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, NYPD detectives turned killers for the Mafia. Their recruitment marked one of the most shocking twists in mob history, turning the law into a lethal asset and changing the dynamics of power forever. It began in the late 1980s, a time when the Mafia's grip on New York was both tightening and fracturing. Federal investigations were closing in. Witnesses were disappearing. The police, once considered an obstacle, became a valuable resource in the shadows of the underworld. Casso, always a step ahead, recognized this opportunity early. He understood that true power didn't come just from guns and fear, but from information and control of the very systems meant to stop him. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa were veteran detectives within the NYPD's elite ranks. They had reputations as tough, effective officers. But behind their badges lay a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. Both men were deeply entrenched in corruption, motivated by greed and a desire for influence. Their paths crossed, with Casso's through mutual contacts in the criminal underworld, and the relationship quickly evolved from mutual benefit to complicity in murder. Casso offered them more than just money. He offered power, protection, and a front-row seat to the Mafia's inner workings. For the detectives, it was an invitation to live beyond the constraints of law enforcement, to partake in a world where their actions were unchallenged, their motives unquestioned. And so they crossed the line, from protectors of the law to assassins in its shadow. The partnership was unprecedented. Ippolito and Caracappa became Casso's eyes and ears inside the police department. They fed him sensitive information, ongoing investigations, surveillance details, informant identities. With this knowledge, Casso could anticipate raids, silence threats before they materialized, and evade capture time and time again. The Mafia's reach had extended into the very fabric of justice, but their role went beyond intelligence. They became active participants in murder. Carrying out hits under Casso's direction, the detectives wielded their authority and weapons to eliminate targets. Their status as law enforcement officers gave them a cloak of invisibility, access to crime scenes, the ability to tamper with evidence, and the trust of fellow officers. They exploited this trust to turn the city's protectors into executioners. Point 1. Of their earliest known murders was that of a suspected informant who had approached the FBI with evidence against the Lucchese family. Ippolito and Caracappa lured the man into a trap, shot him execution style, and covered up the crime with calculated precision. This was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a pattern, an ongoing campaign of assassination carried out. Under the guise of law and order, the implications were staggering. For years, the Mafia had operated under the threat of police and federal intervention. Now, those threats were compromised from within. The line between cop and criminal blurred, until it vanished altogether. Casso's ability to use corrupt officers as weapons gave him a terrifying advantage over rivals and law enforcement alike. Inside the NYPD, suspicions existed, but proving corruption at such a high level was nearly impossible. Ippolito and Caracappa were skilled at covering their tracks, manipulating case files, intimidating witnesses, and leveraging their positions to deflect scrutiny. Their actions eroded the department's credibility and sowed distrust among honest officers, who found themselves fighting not only criminals, but also their own compromised colleagues. The relationship between Casso and his corrupt detectives was symbiotic. The detectives received financial rewards, luxurious gifts, and a level of influence unmatched by most officers. Casso gained unprecedented protection and the ability to strike fear into his enemies with the knowledge that even the police were under his control. This mutual dependency blurred the boundaries of law and crime, creating a dangerous hybrid that operated in the city's shadows. But this alliance came at a cost. With each murder, each cover-up, the risk of exposure grew. The scale of corruption was vast, and the number of victims mounting. Informants within the mafia began whispering about the mafia cops. Law enforcement agencies grew wary, launching covert investigations into police corruption. The very system that allowed Ippolito and Caracappa to operate would ultimately become the instrument of their downfall. The detectives' downfall began with a string of suspicious murders and an informant's testimony that revealed the chilling truth. Undercover operations and wiretaps slowly unraveled the web of deceit. It became clear that the mafia's reach within the NYPD was deeper than anyone had imagined, and at the center stood Ippolito and Caracappa, executing the will of one of the city's most feared mobsters. Their arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the mafia alike. It was a stunning betrayal of public trust, a reminder that the greatest threats sometimes come from within. Their trial revealed graphic details of the murders they committed, the bribes they accepted, and the lives they destroyed. The courtroom became a stage for a drama of corruption, violence, and betrayal on a scale few had witnessed. For Casso, the exposure of his connection to corrupt cops was both a blessing and a curse. It demonstrated the extent of his power and reach, but also exposed vulnerabilities. The law enforcement agencies, embarrassed and enraged, intensified their pursuit. The cracks in Casso's empire began to widen, yet even as the noose tightened, Casso maintained his silence. He refused to testify or cooperate. His code of silence held firm, even as the walls closed in around him. His alliance with Ippolito and Caracappa was a testament to his ability to manipulate and control, a demonstration that his reign was built not only on fear, but also on a calculated use of the system itself. The story of the mafia cops remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of organized crime. It revealed the dangerous extent of corruption within law enforcement and the extraordinary lengths to which the mafia would go to protect its power. It exposed a reality where the lines between good and evil were blurred, where justice was a commodity to be bought, and where the killers wore badges. Anthony Gaspipe Casso's recruitment of Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa was more than just a tactical move. It was a seismic shift in the underworld's relationship with law enforcement. It underscored the lengths he was willing to go to maintain control, to silence opposition, and to become untouchable. But such power built on corruption is inherently unstable. The mafia cops' eventual exposure was inevitable, and their downfall set in motion the unraveling of Casso's empire. The law, corrupted but resilient, fought back. The system began to reclaim itself in the end. The story of Casso and his corrupt detectives is a stark reminder that in the shadowy world of organized crime, trust is fragile, power is fleeting, and the line between protector and predator can vanish without warning. It is a tale of betrayal that shattered institutions, ruined lives, and forever changed the city's fight against the mafia. Chapter 8. The Gold-Plated Trigger. By the early 1990s, Anthony Gaspipe Casso had solidified a reputation that transcended fear. He had become the very embodiment of lethal authority within the New York underworld. His name whispered in hushed tones across the streets, synonymous with unyielding violence and calculated brutality. It was during this period that his rise culminated in one of the most coveted positions in organized crime, underboss of the Lucchese family. But this was no ceremonial title. It was a mantle forged in blood, earned through a relentless campaign of murders that reshaped the mafia's power landscape. Casso's journey to underboss was not one of inherited privilege or luck. It was a calculated ascent, marked by a trail of rivals, traitors, and enemies who met their end under his direction. He was more than an enforcer. He was an executioner, a strategist who understood that power in the mafia was maintained not just through alliances, but through decisive elimination of threats. Each hit was a chess move, designed to consolidate control and send a chilling message to anyone who dared challenge his authority. The moniker gold-plated trigger was more than just a nickname. It was a symbol of Casso's ruthless efficiency and deadly precision. Where others might hesitate or seek negotiation, he struck swiftly and without mercy. The gold plating suggested not only the value placed on his services, but also the high cost paid by those who crossed him. In a world where loyalty was demanded but rarely earned, Gaspipe's trigger was the ultimate arbiter of fate. His murders were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated executions. He targeted those suspected of disloyalty within the Lucchese family, soldiers who whispered to law enforcement, captains who harbored ambitions, and outsiders who threatened the family's dominion. Each victim was chosen not only for what they had done, but for the potential danger they represented. In Casso's calculus, hesitation was betrayal, and betrayal was a death sentence. One of the most notorious killings under his command was that of a high-ranking member who had been quietly cooperating with federal agents. The man's disappearance was sudden and unexplained, leaving a vacuum that Casso quickly filled with trusted loyalists. This move not only eliminated a security risk, but also reinforced the message that cooperation with law enforcement was met with absolute finality. The silence that followed was a testament to Casso's reach and resolve. His rise was not without resistance. Within the Lucchese family, factions formed, some loyal to the old guard, others swayed by the promise of change under Amuso and Casso. The internal war was brutal, with ambushes, assassinations, and betrayals becoming daily realities. Casso's ability to navigate this treacherous landscape, while maintaining his iron grip on the family's enforcement arm, distinguished him as a formidable power broker. Casso's influence extended beyond his own family. Rival bosses and crews took note of the Lucchese underboss's growing audacity. His willingness to cross traditional boundaries, eliminate high-profile targets, and manipulate law enforcement through corruption made him both feared and grudgingly respected. In a brutal underworld where strength was currency, Gaspipe was the wealthiest man, but with power came paranoia. The very violence that elevated him also isolated him. Trust became a scarce commodity. Associates who once followed without question began to hedge their bets, seeking protection from law enforcement or rival families. The stakes grew higher, and Casso's actions became increasingly desperate to maintain dominance. His personal involvement in murders escalated. Unlike many mob leaders who delegated such dirty work, Casso often took part directly, pulling triggers, orchestrating hits, and overseeing the disposal of bodies. His hands were not clean by any measure. They were stained deeply with blood. This hands-on approach cemented his reputation as a man who not only commanded fear, but embodied it. Federal authorities intensified their efforts to dismantle the Lucchese family's reign. The list of unsolved murders, missing persons, and mysterious disappearances painted a grim picture of the family's activities. Casso's role in these events became a focal point of investigations, but his web of corruption and intimidation made building cases difficult. Witnesses vanished, evidence was tampered with, and informants recanted. The gold-plated trigger seemed untouchable. However, the very nature of Casso's brutal methods sowed the seeds of his downfall. The fear he instilled in others eventually extended to those within his own circle. Betrayals multiplied, and whispers of discontent grew louder. His enemies within the family began to see that the cost of allegiance to Gaspipe was survival itself. Some chose silence. Others chose defection. Despite this, Casso's grip on the underworld remained ironclad. He continued to order hits with cold precision, eliminating threats before they could materialize. His strategies evolved, incorporating his corrupt connections within law enforcement to stay ahead of investigations. He was a man who had mastered the dark art of survival in a world defined by death. The title of underboss was both a crown and a shackle. It granted Casso immense power, but it also placed a target squarely on his back. He was the face of the family's violence, the executor of its darkest deeds. This duality defined his reign, respected and feared by allies, reviled and hunted by enemies. As the 1990s dawned, the tide began to turn. Federal prosecutors, armed with new evidence and testimony from defectors, started to close in. The empire Casso had built on fear and blood showed signs of cracking. Yet, until the very end, Gaspipe remained unrepentant, a man defined by violence, driven by a desire for control and unwilling to surrender. The legacy of Anthony Gaspipe Casso's tenure as Lucchese underboss is one of unparalleled brutality. He transformed the role from one of political influence to a reign of terror. The gold-plated trigger he wielded was both a symbol and a weapon, a testament to the deadly power of fear when fused with ambition. In the annals of organized crime, few names carry the weight of Gaspipe Casso's. His story is a stark reminder of the lethal consequences when power is pursued without conscience and violence becomes the language of survival. The blood he spilled secured his throne, but it also charted the path to his inevitable fall. Chapter 9. The Lucchese Coup. In the shadowed alleys and smoke-filled back rooms of New York's underworld, power was always a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of violence and betrayal. But few moments in mafia history were as decisive, as brutal, or as transformative as the coup orchestrated by Anthony Gaspipe Casso and Vittorio Vic Amuso in the early 1990s. This was no mere change of leadership. It was a violent upheaval, a purge that swept away the old guard and ushered in a new era, a reign of fear, unrelenting and absolute. The Lucchese family, one of the city's most powerful crime syndicates, had long been governed by traditional hierarchies and codes. The older generation, seasoned, cautious, steeped in the mafia's unwritten laws, held sway. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. Younger, more ruthless figures like Amuso and Casso hungered for control. Their vision was clear: consolidate power through violence and fear, and remake the family in their own brutal image. The stage for the coup was set through years of calculated moves. Casso, with his gold-plated trigger, and Amuso, with his cold strategic mind, built alliances, identified enemies, and prepared their forces. They exploited internal divisions and seized upon betrayals. The old guard, confident in their tenure and traditions, underestimated the ferocity of this rising faction. When the moment came, the violence was swift and merciless. Targets were selected carefully: capos, soldiers, and associates who remained loyal to the previous leadership. They were labeled traitors, obstacles to progress, and threats to the new order. Many were ambushed, others disappeared without trace. The message was unmistakable: resistance would be met with death. Casso's crews moved with ruthless efficiency. Killings were executed in broad daylight and shadowed nights alike. Streets once ruled by respect became battlegrounds drenched in blood. Each murder not only eliminated a rival, but served as a terrifying warning to the rest of the family and to the city at large. Amid this chaos, the Lucchese hierarchy was dismantled and rebuilt. Positions of power were filled by loyalists, men who pledged absolute allegiance to the new regime. This restructuring was not only about control, but about loyalty enforced through fear. Those who doubted found their doubts silenced permanently. The coup sent shockwaves through the mafia world. Other families watched warily, recognizing that the balance of power was shifting. The brutality displayed by Amuso and Casso shattered old conventions about leadership and loyalty. The era of negotiated truces and cautious diplomacy was over. In its place rose a regime governed by intimidation and absolute authority. For the rank-and-file soldiers, the coup was a terrifying lesson. Trust became a luxury they could no longer afford. Friendships fractured under suspicion. Each meeting was a potential death sentence. The atmosphere of paranoia permeated every corner of the family's operations. Survival depended not just on strength, but on vigilance and obedience. Federal law enforcement agencies took note of the sudden surge in violence. The murders, disappearances, and shifts in the Lucchese family drew increased scrutiny. Yet, the reign of fear also complicated investigations. Witnesses were too afraid to speak. Informants vanished or refused to cooperate. The silence enforced by the new leadership was deafening. Casso himself was central to the coup's execution and its aftermath. His reputation for brutality made him the perfect instrument of terror. He was both strategist and enforcer, a man who could order a hit and carry it out with his own hands if necessary. His presence ensured that the new order would not be challenged lightly. The consequences of the coup extended beyond the Lucchese family. It destabilized the delicate equilibrium among New York's organized crime syndicates. Alliances shifted. Rival families reevaluated their positions. Some saw opportunity in the chaos, others feared escalation. The violent takeover heralded a period of intensified gang warfare and shifting loyalties across the city. Yet, within the family, not everyone embraced the new regime. Some former loyalists sought refuge outside the criminal world, others turned informant, and some prepared for retaliation. The coup had sown seeds of division that would later blossom into internal strife and further violence. Despite the internal and external turmoil, Amuso and Casso's coup solidified their control for a time. They transformed the Lucchese family from a traditional mafia outfit into a feared criminal empire, ruled through terror and enforced with absolute power. The old guard's cautious ways were swept aside, replaced by a relentless pursuit of dominance. This reign of fear, however, was a double-edged sword. While it secured their power, it also alienated allies and fueled enemies. The brutality that established their rule planted the roots of eventual downfall. As whispers of betrayal multiplied and law enforcement's pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in the seemingly unbreakable facade. The Lucchese coup stands as a stark chapter in organized crime history, a testament to the deadly consequences of ambition unchecked by morality. Anthony Gaspipe Casso and Vic Amuso's violent ascent reshaped not only their family, but the entire underworld landscape, leaving a legacy marked by blood, fear, and the harsh realities of power seized through violence. Chapter 10. Rule Through Terror. The rise of the Mafia's most dangerous duo. At the height of their power, Vittorio Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso were more than mere leaders of the Lucchese crime family. They were architects of an empire built on fear, brutality, and absolute control. Their reign transformed the Lucchese family from a criminal organization governed by tradition and unwritten codes into a ruthless dictatorship, where dissent was crushed and survival depended on unwavering obedience. This chapter delves into the terrifying reality of their rule, the rise of the Mafia's most dangerous duo. From the moment they seized control, Amuso and Casso instilled a regime where terror was the currency of power. Gone were the days when diplomacy and subtlety tempered violence. Instead, every order, every decision was underscored by the threat of death. Their leadership was marked not just by strategic prowess, but by an unrelenting campaign of assassinations, intimidation, and psychological warfare designed to maintain ironclad authority. Amuso, the cold and calculating boss, and Casso, the relentless executioner, complemented each other perfectly. Where Amuso's mind plotted the family's direction with ruthless efficiency, Casso delivered punishment with merciless precision. Together, they orchestrated a reign that would send shockwaves through the mafia world and law enforcement alike. The sheer scale of their violence was staggering. Between the early and mid-1990s, the Lucchese family's hit list grew to include hundreds, soldiers, captains, associates, and suspected informants. No one was exempt. Even those with long-standing loyalties found themselves vulnerable if suspicion touched them. The traditional protections offered by rank and tenure evaporated under Amuso and Casso's rule. Their methods went beyond mere physical elimination. Psychological terror became a weapon of choice. Stories circulated of bodies found in brutal conditions, of warnings delivered in blood and brutality, of families shattered by sudden violence. These acts were designed not only to remove threats, but to send clear, terrifying messages. Loyalty was mandatory, betrayal was fatal. This atmosphere permeated every level of the Lucchese family. Meetings were conducted under watchful eyes. Orders were carried out with swift finality. Fear governed relationships between soldiers and leaders, between associates and captains. Trust became a luxury few could afford. Paranoia spread like wildfire, breeding a climate where suspicion often led to preemptive strikes, sometimes against innocent men. The dictatorship imposed by Amuso and Casso extended beyond internal family dynamics. Their reach influenced labor unions, construction contracts, narcotics distribution, and illegal gambling. Businesses across New York City operated under the shadow of their control, subject to extortion, racketeering, and violence. Their dominion was comprehensive and merciless. Corruption within law enforcement further bolstered their reign. The infiltration of police departments and unions provided them with protection and intelligence, enabling preemptive strikes against rivals and informants. The mafia's grip on the city was not merely physical but systemic, entwined with institutions designed to maintain order. However, such an oppressive regime demanded constant vigilance. Amuso and Casso ruled with paranoia as well as power. They surrounded themselves with loyalists but never ceased to suspect betrayal. The consequences of perceived disloyalty were swift and brutal. Even minor infractions or whispered doubts could lead to execution. This environment fostered an ever-present tension within the family. The brutality of their regime also alienated many within the mafia world. Other families viewed the Lucchese leadership with a mixture of fear and disdain. Their excesses destabilized delicate alliances and increased the volatility of inter-family relations. While some feared open confrontation, others saw the violent dictatorship as a threat to the balance of power. Internally, the relentless cycle of violence sowed discord. Some members sought escape, turning informant or fleeing the criminal life. Others prepared for the day when Amuso and Casso would be vulnerable. The seeds of their downfall were planted amidst the terror they unleashed. For the outside world, the duo's reign was a dark chapter in New York's criminal history. Innocent lives were caught in the crossfire. Communities lived under the shadow of mob violence. Families of victims bore the scars of loss and fear. Law enforcement faced unprecedented challenges combating a crime family so entrenched in terror and corruption. Yet, despite the growing pressure, Amuso and Casso maintained their grip for years. Their mastery of fear and control, combined with their strategic use of violence and corruption, made them nearly untouchable. They were symbols of power, dangerous, remorseless, and relentless, but no reign built on terror can endure forever. The increasing weight of their crimes, the fractures within their ranks, and the determined efforts of law enforcement slowly chipped away at their empire. Their story is a testament to the devastating power of fear as a tool of control, and the inevitable collapse that follows when such power is wielded without restraint in the annals of organized crime. The rise of Amuso and Casso stands as a grim reminder. The most dangerous dictatorships are those born of violence and ruled through terror, where human lives are expendable and loyalty is demanded at the barrel of a gun. Their legacy is one of blood and fear, etched indelibly into the history of the mafia and the city they terrorized. Chapter 11. Kill Orders and Paranoia. In the shadowy corridors of organized crime, trust is a fragile thread, easily frayed, impossible to fully reclaim once broken. For Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the relentless ascent to power was matched only by the consuming paranoia that began to cloud his mind. At the height of his reign, loyalty became an obsession, a precious commodity guarded by suspicion and brutal consequence. The line between friend and foe blurred, and the slightest hint of betrayal could trigger a death sentence. This chapter chronicles the dark spiral of kill orders and paranoia that consumed Casso, where suspicion bred violence, and even those closest to him were not safe. The Lucchese family underboss had built his empire on fear and ruthless efficiency. Yet, as the years passed and law enforcement pressures increased, Casso's grip on control tightened in tandem with his mistrust. Paranoia grew like a malignant tumor, feeding off every whisper, every rumor, every flicker of disloyalty. In his mind, survival demanded eliminating any possible threat, even if that threat was imagined or born of misinterpretation. The core of this paranoia was a fundamental truth of the mafia world. Betrayal meant death. But under Casso's rule, the definition of betrayal expanded wildly. It was no longer limited to overt acts of treason or cooperation with law enforcement. Doubt, hesitation, and perceived disloyalty became equally dangerous. The fog of suspicion enveloped the family, and Casso's kill orders grew more frequent, more erratic. His enemies were legion, but so too were his victims. Trusted soldiers, longtime allies, and even members of his own family, sons, nephews, and cousins, found themselves marked by Casso's unyielding mandate. The traditional bonds of blood and brotherhood dissolved under the weight of fear. Men who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Gaspipe found themselves targeted, hunted, and eliminated. One chilling aspect of this period was the speed and decisiveness with which Casso acted. No lengthy investigation or trial preceded his orders. Often, a mere suspicion whispered in his ear, a slip of a tongue, or a fleeting glance was enough to seal a man's fate. Kill squads operated relentlessly, moving like shadows through the city, erasing those deemed threats with cold precision. This atmosphere of pervasive fear was not limited to the Lucchese family's ranks. It spilled into the wider criminal community, and even into Casso's personal life. Close confidants lived in constant anxiety, knowing that any misstep, or even innocent misunderstandings, could lead to their demise. Family gatherings were tinged with tension, and the lines between ally and enemy blurred beyond recognition. That Casso's paranoia was fueled further by the increasing number of informants and government witnesses emerging from within the mafia. Each defection was a dagger to his pride and power. It stoked his fury and deepened his suspicion of everyone around him. He saw betrayal everywhere, in quiet corners, in hushed conversations, in eyes that avoided his gaze. His methods for identifying potential traitors were ruthless. Torture, intimidation, and interrogation became routine. Those suspected were often subjected to brutal questioning, sometimes ending in summary executions. The message was clear: silence was non-negotiable. Fear was the glue holding the family together, but it was a brittle and dangerous bond. Amid this reign of terror, Casso's relationship with his longtime partner, Vicamuzzo, began to strain. While both men wielded fear as a weapon, Casso's paranoia bordered on obsession. The underboss's distrust extended to even those closest to him, including Amuzzo's inner circle. The family's leadership was fracturing, riddled with suspicion and internal power struggles. The violence wrought by Casso's paranoia destabilized the Lucchese family in profound ways. Resources were diverted to rooting out imagined enemies. Loyal soldiers were caught in the crossfire. The family's operational effectiveness suffered as fear eroded cohesion. Allies questioned whether survival under such a tyrannical rule was even possible. Law enforcement agencies watched these internal fractures with growing interest. The chaos offered opportunities for infiltration and witness recruitment. Defectors emerged from the shadows, their testimonies fueled by fear, revenge, or hope for protection. Casso's kill orders, meant to secure his power, paradoxically hastened the unraveling of his empire. One of the most notorious episodes exemplifying this deadly paranoia was the killing of a high-ranking capo who had served the family loyally for decades. Accused, without evidence, of conspiring with rivals, the man was executed swiftly and without trial. His death sent shockwaves through the organization, reinforcing the message that no one was safe, not even the most seasoned and trusted. The repercussions extended beyond the criminal world. Innocent family members and associates caught in the crossfire suffered devastating losses. Communities grieved quietly, their pain a muted backdrop to the unfolding bloodshed. The human toll of Casso's paranoia was immeasurable. Countless lives shattered, futures extinguished under the guise of survival. Yet, even as kill orders multiplied and paranoia consumed him, Casso maintained a veneer of control. His outward persona remained that of a cold, calculating leader. But behind closed doors, the relentless fear gnawed at him, isolating him from allies and loved ones alike. His empire, built on the foundation of terror, was becoming a prison of his own making. The final years of Casso's reign were marked by increasing instability. His ruthless purges left the Lucchese family weakened, fractured by mistrust and internal conflict. His inability to distinguish real threats from imagined ones eroded confidence in his leadership. The reign of terror he had unleashed began to unravel the very power it sought to secure. Ultimately, Casso's obsession with loyalty and the endless stream of kill orders became his undoing. As law enforcement closed in, aided by defectors and insiders weary of bloodshed, the empire built on paranoia crumbled. The price of ruling through fear proved too high, even for a man as ruthless as Gaspipe. This chapter stands as a haunting testament to the corrosive power of suspicion and violence. It reveals how, in the shadowed world of organized crime, the thirst for control can turn even the strongest leaders into prisoners of their own fears, where kill orders become both weapon and curse, and paranoia becomes a deadly legacy. Chapter 12. Gaspipe's War on the Commission. The Mafia Commission was the iron heart of organized crime in New York, a clandestine council of the city's 5 most powerful families, convening in secret to arbitrate disputes, enforce rules, and preserve a fragile peace. For decades, the commission maintained a delicate balance, preventing open warfare among the families, regulating power struggles through negotiation, and upholding an unwritten code that bound even the most ruthless mobsters. But by the early 1990s, this ancient order was shaken to its core. At the center of that upheaval stood Anthony Gaspipe Casso, a man whose boundless ambition, unchecked brutality, and growing paranoia would pit him against the very institution. Designed to contain men like him, Casso's ascent in the Lucchese family was meteoric, built on a foundation of fear, violence, and strategic cunning. Yet his rise brought with it a dangerous disregard for tradition. Where others in the mafia saw the commission as a sacred body, the final word in disputes, and a symbol of shared power, Casso saw an obstacle to be crushed. His belief was simple: power was absolute, and any institution that threatened it was an enemy. The commission, with its complex rules and collective decision-making, was no exception. The war on the commission did not erupt overnight. It began as a subtle erosion of respect, a series of calculated provocations masked as strategic moves. Casso's first acts of defiance targeted key figures loyal to the commission's authority, men whose influence threatened to curtail his ambitions. Through assassinations and intimidation, Casso sent a message: the old guard's era was over, and a new reign was dawning. This brutal campaign against the commission's loyalists shattered the mafia's equilibrium. Rival families watched in alarm as the Lucchese underboss systematically dismantled the balance of power. The commission, accustomed to wielding its influence behind the scenes, found itself powerless in the face of Gaspipe's audacity. Violence replaced diplomacy. Assassinations, once rare and carefully sanctioned, became weapons of mass disruption. Among the most prominent targets of this violent crusade was John Gotti, the flamboyant and feared boss of the Gambino family. Gotti and Casso represented opposing forces within the criminal underworld. Gotti, the master of spectacle and influence. Casso, the embodiment of ruthless execution and raw brutality. Their rivalry intensified the war, igniting deadly confrontations that rippled through New York streets. Attempts were made on each other's lives. Alliances fractured, and the Commission's authority was openly challenged for the first time in its history. The Casso's war extended far beyond New York's borders, unsettling mafia families across the nation. The Commission's role as a mediator and stabilizer came under unprecedented strain. Mobsters who had long relied on the Commission's authority to resolve disputes found themselves plunged into chaos. The organized crime network that had held the country's underworld together for decades now teetered on the brink of collapse. Within the Lucchese family, Casso's campaign fostered deep divisions. While some embraced his vision of uncompromising dominance, others feared the chaos he unleashed. The old guard, those who remembered a time when violence was measured and power shared, were either eliminated or sidelined. The family's cohesion, frayed as paranoia spread, fueled by a leadership that demanded loyalty through fear. That Gaspipe's audacity was not born merely from bravado. It was fueled by a dangerous sense of invincibility. His network of corrupt police officers, informants, and loyal soldiers gave him a shield against law enforcement and rival factions. This web of influence allowed him to act with impunity, striking at enemies while evading consequences. The corrupt detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, known as the Mafia Cops, were vital cogs in this shield, providing intelligence, protection, and sometimes even carrying out murder on Casso's behalf. Yet this perceived invulnerability only heightened Casso's recklessness. Believing himself untouchable, he pushed boundaries further, ignoring the warning signs that his violent crusade was eroding the very foundation of the Mafia's power. The Commission, once an untouchable institution, was now a battlefield, and Casso was the most dangerous combatant. Law enforcement agencies seized on the chaos unleashed by Casso's war on the Commission. The spike in violence and high-profile murders drew significant attention. The FBI, the DEA, and the NYPD ramped up their investigations, targeting not only the Lucchese family but the Mafia network as a whole. Surveillance intensified, informants were cultivated. The cracks in the underworld's armor widened, but the true cost of Casso's war was measured not in arrests alone. It was measured in lives lost, families torn apart, and an underworld consumed by fear and suspicion. Innocent bystanders and peripheral associates became casualties in a conflict fueled by paranoia and ambition. The public felt the tremors of this violent upheaval as shootings and bombings spilled into city streets. The internal pressure within the Lucchese family mounted. Casso's increasingly erratic behavior and relentless purges alienated powerful figures within the organization. His refusal to heed counsel or temper his aggression sowed distrust even among his closest allies. Amuso, his longtime partner and boss, began to question Casso's methods, wary of the empire unraveling under the weight of its own violence. Despite the mounting opposition, Casso pressed on. His war was a calculated gamble, a bid for ultimate control that disregarded the costs. He believed that only by breaking the old order could he cement his legacy. But power seized through destruction rarely lasts. The rebellion against the Commission was a gamble with deadly stakes. The climax of this conflict came with a series of violent confrontations and retaliatory hits. The Commission, its patience exhausted, authorized moves to eliminate Casso. Assassination attempts against Gaspipe escalated, each narrowly avoided or suppressed through Casso's loyal enforcers and corrupt law enforcement contacts. The underworld was engulfed in a bloody chess game, with the Commission fighting to restore order and Casso fighting to remain king. Ultimately, Casso's war against the Mafia Commission precipitated his downfall. The very violence that propelled him to power invited relentless scrutiny from law enforcement. His paranoia isolated him, and former allies turned informants, eager to escape the bloody cycle. As witnesses came forward and investigations deepened, the empire he built began to crumble. This chapter of mafia history reveals the catastrophic consequences when one man's ambition tramples centuries-old traditions and institutions. Gaspipe Casso's war on the commission was not only a brutal power struggle, but a reckoning for the mafia itself. It exposed the vulnerabilities beneath the surface of organized crime and set the stage for the collapse of an empire that in the final analysis. Gaspipe's defiance stands as a warning. In the shadowy world of organized crime, power is fleeting. And the old rules, no matter how ancient, exist not out of respect but necessity. To challenge them is to risk everything, including one's very life. And for Anthony Casso, the price of his war on the commission would be paid in blood. Chapter 13. The Reign of Fear. By the early 1990s, the Lucchese crime family was no longer merely a shadowy organization operating behind closed doors. Under Anthony Gaspipe Casso's brutal command, it had transformed into a fortress of dread, an empire ruled not through respect or loyalty, but through the unrelenting weight of terror. The air inside the family's ranks grew thick with suspicion, paranoia, and the constant threat of death. No corner of the organization was untouched. Soldiers went into hiding, longtime associates vanished without explanation, and even the highest bosses found themselves shackled by fear. This reign of fear was unlike any the mafia had seen before. It was a suffocating fog that infiltrated every meeting, every conversation, every glance exchanged in the dimly lit backrooms and hidden safe houses scattered across New York. Casso's vision of control was absolute. To him, fear was not just a tool, it was the foundation upon which his empire would stand. And so, he wielded it mercilessly. The story of how this atmosphere took root begins with Casso's obsession with loyalty and the deadly consequences for those who dared to waver. In the world of organized crime, betrayal is always punished, but under Gaspipe's rule, suspicion alone was enough to seal a man's fate. The line between fact and rumor blurred, and trust became a rare and dangerous commodity. The soldiers of the Lucchese family, once confident and proud of their standing, began to shrink into shadows. The streets they had once controlled now felt like a labyrinth of threats. Many went underground, cutting off communication to avoid drawing attention. Others fled the city altogether, desperate to escape the invisible manhunt set loose by their own leadership. The fear was so palpable that whispers of betrayal often sent men into hiding before any formal accusation was made. Inside the family's inner circles, the mood was equally grim. The leadership, once united by a code of honor and mutual protection, fractured under the pressure. Casso's penchant for ordering hits on even his closest confidants bred an atmosphere of distrust that ate away at the very structure of the organization. No one was immune. Not the captains who had served loyally for years, not the consigliere whose role was to counsel, and not even the boss himself. Vic Amuso's reign became defined by this creeping paranoia. Though officially the family's leader, he found himself increasingly sidelined, cautious of every person in his proximity. The terror that Casso wielded as underboss extended its reach into Amuso's chambers, poisoning alliances and breeding suspicion among those who once stood steadfastly by his side. The mechanisms of fear were both visible and invisible. On one hand, brutal killings, executions carried out with cold precision, served as grisly warnings to those who contemplated disloyalty. On the other, psychological terror permeated the family's culture. Informants, both real and imagined, were everywhere. Phones were tapped, meetings were surveilled, and no conversation was safe from infiltration. This constant surveillance meant that the family operated in a near state of siege. The reach of this reign of fear extended beyond the criminal network to the families and communities tied to the Lucchese organization. Relatives of mobsters lived in dread, knowing that a sudden knock at the door might bring news of death or disappearance. Children grew up in households burdened by secrets and silence, learning early that the shadows carried threats no one dared speak aloud, even within the underworld's code, omerta. The silence demanded by the mafia the climate shifted. Where once silence was a shield, it now became a weapon wielded by Casso to isolate and control. Men were encouraged to report suspicions, to root out traitors among their peers. This twisted loyalty into a tool of division, fragmenting the families. Unity, the relentless purges exacted a heavy toll. Skilled soldiers and trusted enforcers were eliminated, weakening the family's operational effectiveness. Those who remained were burdened with the dual tasks of maintaining illicit enterprises while constantly watching their backs. The once tight-knit organization was unraveling, undone by its own internal war of terror. This internal chaos did not go unnoticed. Rival families, sensing weakness, probed the Lucchese defenses. Inter-family alliances crumbled as the vacuum created by fear invited opportunism and betrayal. The Commission's influence waned as the old balance of power gave way to instability. The underworld, built on fragile equilibrium, was descending into chaos. Law enforcement agencies watched this unraveling with keen interest. The reign of fear, while designed to secure Casso's control, ironically exposed the family to unprecedented risk. Witnesses emerged from the shadows, emboldened by desperation and the hope of protection. Investigations accelerated, leveraging the cracks in the mafia's armor to bring down its leaders one by one. That the personal toll on individuals was immense. Countless lives were shattered, families broken, futures lost, and communities scarred. The cold calculus of power struggles manifested in bloodshed that touched far beyond the criminal sphere. The city itself seemed to recoil from the violence spilling into its streets and neighborhoods. That in this suffocating environment, Gaspipe Casso stood both as ruler and prisoner. His empire of fear demanded constant vigilance and ruthless enforcement, but it also isolated him. The very tactics that made him feared alienated allies and created enemies within. His paranoia deepened, his world shrinking as trust disappeared. He became trapped in a labyrinth of suspicion, where every shadow might hide a traitor and every friend could turn foe. The reign of fear, though effective for a time, proved ultimately unsustainable. The terror that had secured Casso's power planted the seeds of his downfall. It fractured the family, invited law enforcement's intervention, and eroded the human bonds that had once held the mafia together. This chapter is a grim testament to the destructive power of ruling through fear. It shows how an empire built on violence and suspicion cannot endure without consuming itself. The legacy of this dark period is one of fractured loyalty, shattered lives, and the inevitable collapse that follows when terror replaces trust. Chapter 14. Betrayals from Within. In the dark, shadowed corridors of the Lucchese crime family's empire, cracks began to form, small, almost imperceptible fissures that would, in time, grow into gaping chasms. As Anthony, Gaspipe Casso, and Vicamuzzo's reign grew more violent and erratic, their once loyal crew found itself caught in a web of terror and distrust so dense that some saw no choice but to turn against their own. The seeds of betrayal, sown by paranoia, fear, and the instinct for survival, were planted deep within the family, setting the stage for its ultimate unraveling. The Casso's grip on the family had been forged in blood with a merciless streak that few dared challenge. His underbossship was marked by calculated brutality, swift executions, and an unyielding demand for loyalty. Amuzzo, the boss, relied heavily on Casso's iron fist to keep the family in line. Together, they had created a reign that seemed unbreakable. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The climate of fear that Gaspipe imposed was a double-edged sword. While it secured his dominance, it also bred resentment and paranoia. The constant purges and hit orders meant no one was safe, not even those who had once been closest to him. Trusted captains and soldiers disappeared, replaced by new men whose allegiance was often motivated by fear rather than genuine loyalty. This fragile foundation could not hold. Within the Lucchese ranks, whispers of discontent began to circulate. Men who had endured years of loyalty now questioned the wisdom of following a leadership that seemed bent on destruction. Some saw Casso's violent approach as reckless, his brutality as a liability that endangered them all. Amuso's increasing withdrawal into isolation left a leadership vacuum that only intensified the instability. The very tactics that had ensured Gaspipe's power, constant surveillance, encouraging informants, ruthless punishment, now turned inward, fueling suspicion among the family's soldiers. No conversation was safe. Meetings were held in secret, and allegiances shifted in whispers. The Mafia's code, once ironclad, was fraying under the weight of paranoia. One by one, cracks widened. Several members began to quietly distance themselves from the leadership. Some fled the city, fearful for their lives. Others began cooperating with law enforcement, either to protect themselves or to exact revenge on those who had betrayed them. Informants multiplied, their testimonies unraveling the family's carefully guarded secrets. Among the most consequential betrayals was the cooperation of some of Casso's closest aides. These men had seen firsthand the underboss's cruelty and recklessness, and when faced with the possibility of life imprisonment or death, many chose to break the code of silence. Their testimonies would become pivotal in the coming prosecutions, exposing the darkest chapters of the Lucchese family's reign. The growing rift was not limited to individual soldiers. It spread to entire crews within the family. Rivalries, once suppressed under the leadership's iron control, flared anew, as factions jockeyed for power and survival. Loyalties became transactional, alliances shifting as men sought protection or advantage. The once unified Lucchese family was splintering into competing camps. This internal betrayal came at a time when external pressures were mounting. Law enforcement agencies, emboldened by informants and undercover operations, closed in with increasing effectiveness. The FBI and federal prosecutors had begun piecing together a detailed mosaic of crimes, from murders to racketeering, that linked the family's leadership to a broad spectrum of criminal enterprises. The betrayals from within undermined the family's ability to respond. Intelligence leaks hampered operations, and trust, the lifeblood of organized crime, evaporated. Men who once faced danger together now looked over their shoulders, wondering who might be watching or listening. For Casso and Amuso, the betrayal was both a personal and strategic blow. Their paranoia, which had driven the reign of terror, now became a prison. Paranoia bred paranoia, and the two men found themselves increasingly isolated. Friends vanished, allies turned cold. The unshakable bond between boss and underboss, once their greatest strength, was tested by fear and suspicion. The psychological toll was immense. Both men became consumed by the fear of being betrayed, hunted not only by the law but by their own men. Decisions grew erratic. Trust was given to fewer and fewer individuals. The empire they had built on violence and fear was beginning to crumble from within. Yet, despite this unraveling, the public face of the Lucchese family remained one of strength and ruthlessness. The violence continued, the killings relentless. But beneath the surface, the family was unraveling. Every execution ordered by Casso sent shockwaves through the ranks, but also deepened the divide between leadership and soldiers. This chapter in the rise and fall of Gaspipe Casso reveals the fragility beneath the veneer of power. It illustrates how terror, when wielded too broadly, can destroy the very fabric it seeks to control. Betrayal, once an enemy outside the gates, had become a dagger in the heart of the Lucchese family. The seeds planted by fear and suspicion bore bitter fruit, and as the family fractured, law enforcement's net tightened. The internal dissent that had once been whispered in the shadows now became a force that would bring down an empire, ushering in the final chapters of one of the most violent reigns in mafia history. Chapter 15. Under surveillance. For decades, Anthony Gaspipe Casso had operated in the shadows with near impunity. His reign over the Lucchese crime family was marked by brutal violence, ruthless ambition, and an unyielding grip on power. Yet beneath this veneer of invincibility, a slow but relentless threat was closing in, one that would unravel the empire he had built, piece by bloody piece. The FBI, armed with sophisticated technology, patient investigators, and the courage of those willing to break omerta, launched an unrelenting campaign to bring the Lucchese family to its knees. What began as quiet observations soon escalated into a crushing siege of wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations that tightened. The noose around Gaspipe's criminal command, the war on organized crime had evolved. No longer could mobsters rely solely on intimidation or violence to silence witnesses or evade justice. By the 1990s, law enforcement had developed an arsenal of tools to penetrate the mafia's secretive world. Among these, electronic surveillance, wiretapping, phones, bugging meeting places, monitoring financial transactions, proved to be a game changer. The FBI's wiretapping teams operated with painstaking precision, capturing thousands of hours of conversations that peeled back the layers of silence cloaking the Lucchese family's operations. Within the smoky back rooms of New York's underground, men believed themselves untouchable. Yet, every whispered word, every coded message, was recorded and analyzed by federal agents. The tapes revealed a chilling portrait of an empire run with cold calculation. Gaspipe's voice, often calm yet menacing, issued orders for hits, discussed racketeering schemes, and negotiated alliances that shaped the criminal underworld's future. These recordings became invaluable evidence, allowing prosecutors to build airtight cases that would shatter the mafia's walls of secrecy. But surveillance alone was not enough. The FBI's greatest advantage came from human sources, informants, who once lived in fear of Gaspipe's wrath, but ultimately chose to break the code. Some were low-level associates caught in the crossfire of Casso's paranoia. Others were trusted aides who had witnessed the underboss's escalating brutality firsthand. Their insider knowledge provided the FBI with critical details that wiretaps could not capture: the identities of shooters, the locations of secret meetings, and the names of those complicit in the family's darkest deeds. The stakes for these informants were enormous. Breaking the mafia's code meant risking death, betrayal, and exile. Yet, faced with the prospect of life imprisonment or worse, many chose survival over silence. Their testimonies shattered the illusion of invulnerability surrounding Gaspipe and his command. Slowly, the layers of fear and loyalty began to peel away, exposing fractures within the Lucchese family's once formidable facade. Financial investigations further tightened the noose. The FBI traced the family's illicit profits from gambling, drug trafficking, extortion, and construction rackets. Money laundering schemes were uncovered, revealing a web of shell companies and corrupt business relationships designed to hide the proceeds of crime. Following the money trail gave investigators a broader understanding of the family's reach and resources, crucial for dismantling its infrastructure. The infiltration extended to undercover agents who risked their lives to gather first-hand intelligence. Posing as criminals or businessmen, these operatives navigated the perilous world of the mafia, earning the trust of soldiers and associates. Their reports provided real-time insight into operations, disputes, and plans, complementing the FBI's technical surveillance and informant reports. Together, these efforts formed a comprehensive picture that tightened the law enforcement grip. The psychological impact on Gaspipe and his cohorts was profound. The knowledge that their conversations were monitored, their actions scrutinized, sowed mistrust among allies. Paranoia deepened, communications became more cautious and coded, and the fabric of loyalty began to unravel. Gaspipe's own fears of betrayal grew, leading to an increase in violent purges and erratic behavior that further destabilized the family. As arrests loomed and indictments mounted, attempts to intimidate potential witnesses intensified, but these efforts largely failed. The cycle of violence and retribution had exhausted many within the family, weakening the ironclad loyalty that once protected its leaders. The FBI's combination of technology, informants, and relentless investigation broke the code of silence, paving the way for historic prosecutions. This chapter in the saga of Anthony Gaspipe Casso is a testament to the power of modern law enforcement techniques, and human courage against organized crime. It reveals how the most secretive, violent empires are vulnerable when exposed to light, and how patience and persistence can bring even the most feared criminals to justice. The noose was tightening, and the reign of terror that defined Gaspipe's legacy was nearing its final, inevitable fall. Chapter 16. On the Run. When the indictments finally dropped, naming Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso as the masterminds behind a reign of murder, extortion, and corruption, the walls that had long shielded the Lucchese leadership crumbled. With staggering speed, faced with the prospect of spending the rest of their lives behind bars, both men made a desperate choice: to flee. What followed was a harrowing cross-country manhunt, a shadowy flight punctuated by relentless paranoia, shattered alliances, and the creeping realization that the empire they had ruled was unraveling beneath their feet. In the early days of their escape, Amuso and Casso vanished from the public eye, slipping into a web of secrecy carefully spun to avoid detection. But the very networks and loyalties that had sustained their power for decades were strained to the breaking point. No longer the feared kings of the New York underworld, they became hunted fugitives, scrambling to find safe harbor amid a landscape rife with betrayal. Their flight was not simply a physical journey across states. It was a psychological odyssey marked by distrust and fear. Each step forward was shadowed by the dread that someone in their circle might have turned informant, that law enforcement was closing in, that a phone call or a whispered word could betray their location. The intense pressure fractured their closest relationships, exposing vulnerabilities that their enemies, and even their own men, were eager to exploit. For Gaspipe, whose reputation had been built on fear and brutality, the loss of control was devastating. The man who once ordered murders with cold calculation now found himself a prisoner of circumstance, forced to navigate a world where survival meant vigilance and silence. Paranoia, which had once been a tool he wielded against others, now gripped him with a suffocating intensity. Trust became a rare and dangerous commodity. Amuso, too, faced the stark reality of a leader displaced. His role as boss was threatened not only by the law, but by the internal collapse of the family's cohesion. Without the protective armor of power, the old guard crumbled, and rival factions began maneuvering for dominance. The empire that had seemed unshakable was now vulnerable, torn apart by fear and uncertainty. The manhunt itself was a monumental effort. Federal agencies coordinated across jurisdictions, piecing together surveillance data, informant tips, and financial records. The fugitives' movements were tracked through coded communications and undercover operatives who risked everything to close the net. No city was safe, no hideout secure. Each moment on the run was a test of endurance, cunning, and sheer will. As the days stretched into weeks, the physical toll on Amuso and Casso became apparent. Constant vigilance drained them. Sleep was fitful and fleeting. The uncertainty of their fate loomed like a specter. Their paranoia grew with every close call, the flash of headlights, the sound of footsteps outside a safe house, fueling a cycle of fear that was as debilitating as any prison cell. Their attempts to seek refuge among old allies were fraught with danger. Some welcomed them cautiously, while others saw their presence as a liability, too risky, too conspicuous. The bonds of loyalty that had once defined the mafia's internal order weakened under the weight of law enforcement pressure and the threat of self-preservation. Betrayals multiplied, some motivated by greed, others by fear. Throughout their flight, Amuso and Casso maintained contact with their remaining loyalists, issuing coded orders meant to preserve the family's operations and to secure their own survival. But as the noose tightened, these communications grew infrequent and desperate. The network that had once been their greatest strength now threatened to betray them with every intercepted message. The psychological impact of being on the run was immense. Men who had lived in power and privilege were reduced to shadows of themselves, forced into hiding like common criminals. Their identities were stripped away, replaced by aliases and furtive glances over their shoulders. The once feared underboss and boss of the Lucchese family were now fugitives, their legend tempered by the harsh realities of survival. The pursuit culminated in a series of arrests that reverberated through the criminal underworld. With the aid of informants and meticulously gathered evidence, law enforcement dismantled the remaining strongholds of the Lucchese family. Amuso and Casso's flight had delayed the inevitable, but it could not alter the course of justice. This chapter chronicles the final desperate gambit of two men who once ruled an empire of crime, now reduced to fugitives trapped by their own violence and fear. It lays bare the human cost of a life lived in shadows, the exhaustion, the betrayals, and the relentless terror that accompanied every step on the run. The fall from power was as brutal and relentless as their rise, a stark reminder that even the most feared criminals cannot escape the long arm of the law forever. Chapter 17. The Capture. After months of evasion, the relentless pursuit of Anthony Gaspipe Casso reached its harrowing conclusion. In the waning hours of a cold, unrelenting night, federal agents closed in, their operation the culmination of years of investigation, surveillance, and courageous informants. The man who had once ruled the Lucchese family's underworld with an iron fist, feared by allies and enemies alike, was finally captured. But for Gaspipe, capture was not an end, it was the beginning of a new battleground. Behind prison walls, where freedom was stripped away but violence endured, he sought to maintain his grip on power, to orchestrate terror and control from within. The confines of a cell that Casso's arrest sent shockwaves through the mafia and the broader criminal world. His reputation as one of the most violent and unpredictable figures in mafia history was cemented not just by his crimes, but by his unyielding will to dominate, even in captivity. The images of his capture, handcuffed, wary, yet defiant, marked the fall of a kingpin whose influence would stretch far beyond the streets he once ruled. The operation to apprehend Casso was the product of meticulous planning. The FBI had patiently pieced together his movements through a labyrinth of informants and wiretaps. Every step, every conversation, every transaction had been recorded and analyzed. Agents knew the risks. Casso was notorious for his violent retaliation, and any hint of his whereabouts was a matter of life and death. The arrest required precision, stealth, and overwhelming force to prevent bloodshed. Upon entering custody, the transition was jarring for a man who had lived by his own rules. The street's chaos, the threats, and the power struggles of the family were replaced by the cold order of the prison system. Yet, for Gaspipe, confinement was merely a new stage from which to assert control. His mind, sharpened by years of violence and strategy, quickly adapted to this grim environment. Despite the confines of his cell, Casso continued to project influence. Using coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and sheer intimidation, he sought to direct the Lucchese family's operations. His ability to command respect, or fear, was undiminished by bars and guards. The prison walls could contain his body, but not his reach. This capacity to operate behind bars speaks to the complex nature of mafia power structures. The prison system, often viewed as a deterrent or endpoint, became a conduit for continued criminal enterprise. Gaspipe's efforts to maintain control underscored the resilience of organized crime networks, where loyalty, fear, and power are transmitted through whispers and hidden communications. Within prison, Casso's reputation for brutality followed him. Other inmates and guards alike were aware of his violent past and his willingness to exact vengeance. This notoriety granted him a form of protection, but also marked him as a constant threat. The delicate balance of prison life, alliances, rivalries, and survival became a new battleground where Gaspipe's cunning was tested. His continued involvement in ordering hits and enforcing discipline from behind bars intensified the government's efforts to isolate him. Enhanced security measures, segregation, and monitoring were employed to disrupt his communications. Yet, despite these barriers, law enforcement agencies uncovered evidence of ongoing criminal activity linked to Casso, fueling broader investigations. The psychological toll of incarceration was immense. For a man whose identity was forged in violence and domination, the loss of physical freedom challenged his sense of self. The need to project strength and control was both a survival mechanism and a testament to his indomitable will. The prison became a crucible, testing the limits of Gaspipe's influence. That Casso's story behind bars also revealed the complexities of justice and punishment in organized crime. His capture was hailed as a victory for law enforcement, but it also exposed the challenges of dismantling deeply entrenched criminal enterprises. Even confined, he demonstrated the capacity to undermine order, perpetuate violence, and command loyalty. As prosecutors prepared to bring him to trial, the weight of his criminal legacy loomed large. The evidence amassed against him was staggering: murder, racketeering, conspiracy, and corruption. Yet, beyond the legal charges lay a man whose life was defined by chaos and control, a man who refused to be broken by confinement. This chapter in the saga of Anthony Gaspipe Casso offers a window into the persistence of mafia power even when the kingpin is behind bars. It explores the paradox of imprisonment as both punishment and a new front in the battle for control. The capture did not signal an end to violence. Rather, it transformed its theater, underscoring the enduring challenge of confronting organized crime. Chapter 18. The Turncoat. Anthony Gaspipe Casso's name had long been synonymous with fear, violence, and unyielding loyalty to the code of silence that defined the mafia. Yet, in one of the most shocking turns in organized crime history, this feared underboss, this architect of terror, made a choice that stunned the criminal underworld and law enforcement alike. Faced with mounting pressure, betrayal closing in on all sides, and a future shackled behind bars, Gaspipe agreed to do the unthinkable. He flipped. He became one of the highest-ranking mobsters ever to become a government witness. A turncoat whose revelations would shake the foundations of the mafia and forever alter the landscape of law enforcement's battle against organized crime. The decision was not made lightly. For a man whose life was steeped in violence and secrecy, admitting guilt and betraying comrades was the ultimate act of defiance and desperation. Yet, the relentless isolation of prison, the collapse of his criminal empire, and the fear of dying behind bars pushed Casso to confront an agonizing choice. Cooperation with the government offered a slim hope of survival, but at the steep cost of shattering the sacred code of omerta. The initial conversations between Casso and federal prosecutors were fraught with tension and suspicion. Agents approached with a mixture of caution and determination, fully aware that persuading a man of Casso's notoriety to turn informant required extraordinary measures. The offer of protection, reduced sentencing, and a chance to expose his enemies became powerful incentives against a backdrop of desperation and shattered loyalties. Behind closed doors, Casso's mind raced, calculating risks, weighing the consequences, and envisioning a new role not as a ruthless mobster, but as a pivotal source of intelligence. His cooperation promised to be a trove of unprecedented insight into the inner workings of the mafia: names, dates, locations, and crimes previously cloaked in impenetrable silence. It was a treasure trove that prosecutors knew could break the back of organized crime. Yet, this transformation, from feared killer to government witness, carried immense personal peril. By turning, Casso ensured he would be branded a traitor forever, marked for death by those he once commanded and trusted. His decision meant severing ties not just to the mafia's violent world, but to his identity, his past, and the very code that had defined his existence. The price of cooperation was high, and the risks extended far beyond the courtroom. The impact of Casso's flip rippled quickly. The criminal underworld reacted with shock, anger, and swift retribution against those even suspected of cooperating. The fear that had once secured silence now gave way to paranoia and internal purges. Informants, once hidden in shadows, gained protection and prominence. Law enforcement seized the moment, leveraging Casso's testimony to indict and convict. members at every level of the mafia's hierarchy, that Casso's testimony was detailed and unflinching. He recounted murders ordered, alliances forged and broken, corrupt officials bribed, and the daily mechanics of running an empire built on crime and violence. His disclosures exposed the depth of corruption and brutality within the Lucchese family and the wider mafia network. Prosecutors meticulously verified his claims with evidence, wiretaps, and other witnesses, building airtight cases that shattered the myth of mafia invulnerability. The psychological toll on Casso was profound. To recount decades of bloodshed and betrayal required confronting his own darkest acts and the cost they exacted, not just on victims, but on his soul. His cooperation was at times reluctant, haunted by guilt, and punctuated by moments of defiance. Yet it was his cooperation that underscored the fragility of even the most fearsome criminal empires. Law enforcement officials recognized the significance of Casso's cooperation. He was not simply another informant. He was a kingpin who held secrets few others possessed. His knowledge offered an unparalleled opportunity to dismantle criminal networks, to prosecute corrupt law enforcement officers, and to send a message that no one was beyond reach. His cooperation set a precedent that reverberated throughout organized crime. The protection program that shielded Casso was extensive but never absolute. The ever-present threat of retaliation loomed large, forcing him to live a life of constant vigilance. His testimony, given under layers of security and secrecy, was a high-stakes gamble for survival. Each disclosure was a step deeper into an unknown future, far removed from the violent certainty of his past. This chapter reveals a paradox at the heart of organized crime. The very code designed to protect the family could be broken by the weight of pressure and survival instinct. Gaspipe Casso's decision to become a government witness was a turning point not only for his own life, but for the ongoing war against the mafia. It laid bare the vulnerabilities beneath the armor of terror and demonstrated how courage, persistence, and the unraveling of trust could bring even the most fearsome criminals to justice. Chapter 19. The Betrayal of the Feds. The decision of Anthony Gaspipe Casso to cooperate with the government sent ripples through the mafia and law enforcement alike. It was a moment that promised to bring down empires and deliver justice to countless victims. Yet, as the dust settled, a darker, more complex story emerged, one that revealed the fragile, precarious nature of even the most determined attempts to dismantle organized crime from within. Casso's cooperation, initially hailed as a breakthrough, soon spiraled into disaster. Behind the scenes, the man once feared for his brutality became a master of manipulation, weaving lies and deceit that undermined the government's efforts, and ultimately led to his removal from the witness protection program. From the outset, working with Casso was a gamble. Federal prosecutors and agents recognized his immense value, a high-ranking mobster with unparalleled knowledge of the inner workings of the Lucchese family and the wider mafia network. His testimony promised to unravel decades of criminal activity, but they also understood the risks inherent in placing such a volatile and dangerous man under their protection. That Casso's temperament, volatile, cunning, and ruthless, soon complicated matters. His willingness to cooperate was mixed with a streak of defiance and self-interest. Rather than embracing full accountability, he sought to manipulate his handlers, attempting to control the narrative of his cooperation to serve his own ends. This duplicity would become a critical issue as his cooperation unfolded. Early on, there were signs that Casso was not fully forthcoming. He withheld information, exaggerated claims, and at times offered misleading testimony. Investigators found themselves navigating a maze of half-truths and contradictions, where fact and fiction blurred. The challenge of extracting reliable intelligence from a man so steeped in deception became apparent as time progressed. Tensions grew between Casso and the federal teams managing his case. His demands increased, and his cooperation became erratic. Behind his calculating exterior lay a man unwilling to relinquish all control, even at the expense of his own legal standing. The fragile trust between informant and authorities began to fracture, threatening the viability of the entire operation. Casso's attempts to manipulate the government extended beyond mere deception. He actively sought to sow discord among rival factions, to protect allies, and to eliminate perceived enemies, even from within the witness protection framework. His continued engagement in criminal machinations, despite being in custody and under federal supervision, demonstrated a capacity for subversion that alarmed officials. This duplicity had profound consequences. The very evidence that prosecutors hoped would topple the mafia's leadership became compromised. Cases built on Casso's testimony risked being discredited, and witnesses once emboldened by his cooperation were left vulnerable. The credibility of the government's anti-mafia efforts was called into question. The situation deteriorated to the point that federal authorities made the difficult decision to sever ties with Casso. Removing him from the witness protection program was a last resort, a recognition that his cooperation had become more harmful than helpful. This decision sent shockwaves through the justice system and the criminal world, underscoring the challenges of managing high-level informants. Casso's removal marked a turning point not only in his personal saga, but also in the broader fight against organized crime. It exposed the limits of relying on individuals whose nature and past are defined by manipulation and violence. The complex interplay of trust, control, and survival created an unstable foundation for cooperation. The fallout was not limited to legal and procedural consequences. Psychologically, Casso's trajectory reflected the contradictions of a man torn between survival and self-destruction. His attempts to undermine the government that had offered him a lifeline were perhaps rooted in a refusal to accept vulnerability or loss of identity. This internal conflict played out in a high-stakes game with profound implications. Law enforcement agencies learned hard lessons from the Gaspipe Casso episode. It emphasized the need for rigorous vetting, continuous monitoring, and an understanding of the psychological dimensions of informants. The experience shaped future strategies in handling mob turncoats, balancing the potential gains against the risks of deception. This chapter offers a sobering reflection on the fragility of justice. When confronted with the complexities of human nature, it reveals that even in the pursuit of truth and accountability, the shadows of betrayal and manipulation can darken the path. Anthony Casso's cooperation and its unraveling stands as a cautionary tale in the annals of crime and punishment, highlighting the perilous intersection of crime, law enforcement, and human frailty. Chapter 20: Justice Denied. The trials that followed. The fall of Anthony Gaspipe Casso was not a neat conclusion to decades of violence, corruption, and ruthless ambition. Rather, it was the beginning of a prolonged, arduous reckoning that would stretch the limits of the American justice system and expose the profound challenges of dismantling a deeply entrenched criminal empire. The trials that followed his capture and failed cooperation revealed a fractured path to justice. 1. Marked by victories and setbacks, courage and betrayal, truth and deception. Though some corrupt cops were convicted and dozens of mobsters were jailed, the legacy of Gaspipe's reign inflicted wounds that no courtroom could fully heal. From the moment the government secured Casso behind bars, prosecutors launched a sweeping effort to capitalize on the mountain of evidence he had helped amass, albeit imperfectly. They targeted not only members of the Lucchese family, but also the insidious network of crooked cops and public officials who had enabled the mafia's stranglehold on New York City. The trials became sprawling, complex affairs, filled with dramatic testimonies, secret informants, and legal maneuverings worthy of the darkest courtroom dramas. At the heart of these proceedings was the conviction of two of the most infamous figures in law enforcement history, Detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. Once revered protectors of the law, these men had instead become assassins in police uniforms, using their badges to murder for the mafia and protect its illicit interests. Their downfall was a seismic moment, a testament to the corrosive reach of corruption and the blurred lines between crime and justice. The trials of Ippolito and Caracappa revealed chilling details of their double lives, how they carried out hits on rival mobsters, facilitated bribes, and manipulated investigations to serve the Lucchese family's violent agenda. Their betrayals extended beyond the mafia, shaking the very foundations of public trust in the police force. Victims' families, prosecutors, and honest officers alike grappled with the brutal reality that those sworn to protect had become enforcers of terror. Yet, these convictions were just one thread in a vast legal tapestry. The government pursued a litany of charges against dozens of Lucchese operatives, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder and conspiracy. Many of these trials became battlegrounds where lawyers fought fiercely to protect or prosecute figures enmeshed in decades of clandestine violence. Witnesses faced threats, intimidation, and the ever-present fear that silence was safer than truth. The courtroom became a stage where loyalty and betrayal played out in real time. Some witnesses broke their silence and testified against former comrades. Others recanted or disappeared into shadows. Prosecutors relied heavily on cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, and physical evidence painstakingly gathered over years. Each conviction was hard-earned, a small victory in a broader war against an organization designed to survive through fear and secrecy. Despite the progress, the full scope of Casso's damage and the Lucchese family's criminal enterprise was never fully unraveled. The sheer depth of their infiltration into city institutions, the layers of intimidation, and the culture of silence rendered parts of the operation opaque. Some key figures evaded justice, protected by loyalists or lacking sufficient evidence for prosecution. Corruption and violence left scars on neighborhoods and communities that outlasted any courtroom verdict. The trials also highlighted a darker truth. The justice system itself was vulnerable to manipulation and human frailty. Casso's own cooperation, initially heralded as a breakthrough, became a liability. His inconsistent testimony, combined with attempts to mislead and protect certain interests, weakened several cases and cast doubt on others. Prosecutors faced the unenviable task of separating fact from fabrication, truth from self-serving fiction. Moreover, the reliance on informants like Casso underscored the fragile morality at the core of the fight against organized crime. To dismantle a code of silence built on blood and loyalty, authorities had to negotiate with the very individuals who had perpetuated violence and corruption. This uneasy alliance complicated public perception of justice and sometimes left victims and communities feeling betrayed by the system meant to protect them. Nevertheless, the trials succeeded in delivering tangible consequences. Scores of mob figures were imprisoned, their operations disrupted, their reigns curtailed. The convictions of corrupt police officers served as a warning and a catalyst for reform within law enforcement. The mafia's grip on parts of the city was loosened, and law enforcement agencies emerged more vigilant, more aware of the dangers of complacency. Yet, even as courts handed down sentences, the echoes of Casso's violence and betrayal reverberated. Families of victims continued to mourn, and communities struggled to rebuild trust and security. The underworld adapted, recalibrating to new threats and opportunities, proving once again the resilience of organized crime. This chapter delves into the human cost of the trials as much as the legal victories. It explores the experiences of prosecutors who fought against intimidation, witnesses who risked everything to speak out, and families who sought justice amid chaos. Their stories remind us that the pursuit of justice is not simply about verdicts or sentences, but about healing wounds inflicted over generations. Through vivid courtroom scenes and intimate accounts, the narrative captures the tension and drama of a justice system grappling with the complexities of organized crime. It reveals how law and order confronted the ruthless realities of the mafia, often struggling to keep pace with the cunning and violence of those it sought to punish. In the final analysis, the trials that followed Gaspipe Casso's downfall were a testament to both the strength and limits of justice. They demonstrated that while the law can hold individuals accountable and dismantle criminal organizations, it cannot fully erase the legacies of fear, betrayal, and corruption. Justice was served, but it was also denied in the shadows, in the silence, and in the fractures left behind. This chapter challenges us to reflect on what justice truly means in the face of systemic violence and corruption. It is a story of resilience and failure, of courage and compromise, and ultimately, a reminder that the fight against crime is an ongoing struggle, one that requires vigilance, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Chapter 21. Life in the Shadows. The story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso did not end with his dramatic fall from power, his turn as a government witness, or the trials that followed. Instead, it extended into the dim confines of a high-security prison, a place where he would live out his final years, isolated from the world he once controlled and despised by both the mob he betrayed and the government that imprisoned him. In these shadowed walls, Gaspipe's life became a reflection of the brutal consequences of a path defined by violence, loyalty shattered, and the unyielding price of betrayal. The transition from feared mob enforcer and underboss to a prisoner, confined within the sterile, unforgiving environment of federal penitentiaries, was stark. Casso, once commanding respect and terror in equal measure, now existed in a world where his every movement was monitored, where freedom was an illusion, and where his legacy was a burden heavier than any chain. The power he wielded on the streets, the ability to order hits, instill fear, and dictate the fates of friends and foes alike, was stripped away, replaced by isolation and vulnerability. In prison, Casso was a marked man. The Mafia code that once protected him now condemned him as a traitor, a snitch who had broken the sacred omerta. To those still loyal to the mob, his very existence was a provocation, an affront to their laws and their blood-soaked traditions. Threats against his life were a constant shadow. Protective measures were necessary, but could never erase the stigma or the danger he faced. He was a prisoner not only of the state, but of a criminal underworld that demanded retribution. Yet, the government's distrust of Casso was nearly as deep. His history of manipulation and deceit, combined with his volatile temperament, made him an unreliable ally. Prison officials kept him under tight control, wary of any attempt to orchestrate violence or maintain influence from behind bars. He was confined to special units designed to minimize his contact with other inmates and staff, reducing his ability to foment unrest or continue criminal enterprises. Despite this containment, Casso's psychological state was complex and often volatile. Years of imprisonment, coupled with the loss of power and status, weighed heavily on him. The man who had once thrived in chaos found himself grappling with the silence of confinement and the crushing reality of defeat. Reports from prison staff and interviews with those who encountered him describe a man wrestling with bitterness, regret, and moments of dark reflection. Yet, even in these shadows, traces of the old Gaspipe remained. His sharp mind, his street-hardened instincts, and his unyielding pride shaped his interactions. Casso was known to be defiant, resistant to authority, and prone to explosive outbursts. He challenged guards, refused cooperation, and clung to a fierce sense of identity shaped by a lifetime of violence. His presence in prison was a constant reminder of the dangerous legacy he carried. The isolation exacted a toll not only physically but emotionally. Cut off from family and the outside world, Casso's existence became a study in loneliness and alienation. Visits were limited and often tense, reflecting the complex web of relationships he had left behind. The world outside moved on, but inside those high-security walls, time seemed suspended, a grim echo chamber where past deeds and present punishment collided. Medical records and testimony reveal that Casso's health declined in his final years. The stress of imprisonment, combined with underlying conditions, eroded his physical resilience. Despite medical care, his body bore the scars of a life lived on the edge, a life that had taken its toll far beyond the streets. The image of Gaspipe, once indomitable, diminished in these final days, reduced to a shadow of the man who had once ruled through fear, In this chapter of isolation, the broader implications of Casso's fall become clear. His life in the shadows was a testament to the brutal consequences of crossing the delicate balance between loyalty and betrayal in the mafia world. It underscored the reality that the price of survival in organized crime is often exile, loneliness, and a permanent mark as an outcast. The story of Casso's prison years also raises profound questions about justice and punishment. How does society reconcile the need to punish with the human dignity owed to even its most dangerous criminals? What does redemption mean in a world defined by unrelenting violence and treachery? Casso's existence behind bars serves as a stark meditation on these dilemmas, challenging simplistic notions of crime and consequence. As we look deeper into his final years, the contrast between the man and the myth emerges. The legend of Gaspipe, the ruthless killer, the feared enforcer, was at odds with the reality of a man confined, vulnerable, and haunted by his past. This duality reflects the complex human dimension behind headlines and histories, reminding us that even the darkest figures are shaped by pain, fear, and loss. The story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso's life in the shadows is a somber coda to a violent saga. It is a narrative marked by downfall, isolation, and the relentless consequences of a life lived outside the law. As he faded from the public eye, confined to prison walls, the echoes of his legacy continued to reverberate. Through the families shattered by violence, the institutions scarred by corruption, and the ongoing struggle to confront the shadows left behind by one of the mafia's most dangerous killers. Chapter 22. The Body Count. The legacy of Anthony Gaspipe Casso is inseparable from the trail of blood he left in his wake, a chilling ledger of violence etched into the dark history of organized crime. Over 3 decades, Gaspipe became synonymous with ruthless efficiency and merciless retribution. His confirmed victims number over 30, a grim testament to his capacity for cold-blooded murder. Yet, this figure, horrifying in its magnitude, tells only part of the story. Dozens more deaths, friends, allies, rivals, and innocent bystanders remain shrouded in suspicion, their fates sealed in the silence of the streets and the shadows of the mafia's deadly code. That Gaspipe's rise to power was paved with the bodies of those who crossed him, betrayed the Lucchese family, or stood in the way of his relentless ambition. From early on, murder was not merely a tool, but an extension of his identity. The killings were calculated, purposeful, and brutal, meant to instill fear, enforce loyalty, and eliminate opposition without hesitation or remorse. His reputation as the mafia's most dangerous killer was not earned by idle threat. It was forged in the blood-soaked reality of his actions. Among the confirmed victims, some were high-profile figures within the underworld, men whose deaths sent shockwaves through the crime families and disrupted the delicate balance of power. These were the executions of rivals and traitors, swift and absolute, meant to silence dissent and consolidate control. Gaspipe's hand was often the invisible force behind these hits, ordering and orchestrating with cold precision. His capacity to sanction such violence elevated him within the ranks, but also intensified the climate of fear that permeated the Lucchese family. Yet, the body count extended far beyond rival mobsters. The nature of Casso's reign meant that his violence touched many lives indiscriminately. Allies who faltered or questioned his decisions found themselves targets. Innocent civilians, caught in crossfire, victims of intimidation, or collateral damage, became unwilling participants in a deadly game they never chose to play. Each death was a fragment of a larger mosaic of terror, a grim reminder of the human cost of Gaspipe's path. The victims' stories reveal the depth and breadth of Casso's violence. Some were close associates, men who had once stood at his side but fell victim to paranoia or the brutal demands of loyalty. Family members and childhood friends were not immune. Betrayal and suspicion spared no one in the quest for power and control. The personal was inseparable from the criminal, and the line between ally and enemy was razor-thin in Gaspipe's world. Investigations and testimonies over the years have painstakingly pieced together many of these murders, exposing the grim methods employed. Shotguns, pistols, strangulation. Each killing bore Gaspipe's signature ruthlessness. Scenes of brutality often served as warnings, messages carved in flesh and blood to deter defiance. Yet, even as law enforcement built cases against him, many murders remained unsolved, lost in a haze of fear and silence that blanketed the mafia's domain. The enormity of this body count had far-reaching implications. It shaped the culture of terror that defined the Lucchese family's operations during Gaspipe's ascendancy. Soldiers lived in constant fear, wary that a whisper of disloyalty might be their last. The underworld operated under a pall of dread, where trust was fragile and life was cheap. Gaspipe's violence was a tool of governance, a language of control that communicated with deadly clarity. Beyond the immediate victims, the ripple effects of these murders devastated communities. Families left grieving, shattered by sudden loss, and the cruel ambiguity of unsolved crimes. Neighborhoods scarred by violence and the shadow of organized crime, where fear suppressed justice and silence became survival. The body count was not merely a statistic. It was a profound social wound, a legacy that outlasted the man himself. Moreover, the psychological toll on those who survived Gaspipe's reign was immense. Survivors bore the scars of trauma and loss, haunted by memories of violence and betrayal. For some, the threat was never distant. For others, it emerged unexpectedly in the disappearance of a friend or the violent death of a neighbor. This pervasive atmosphere of fear shaped identities and communities in ways that law enforcement and courts struggled to address fully. The chapter of Gaspipe's body count is also a study in the limitations of justice. Despite the many murders linked to him, not all perpetrators faced consequences. Some killings remained buried beneath layers of silence and intimidation, hidden in the mafia's code of omerta. Others were thwarted by lack of evidence or witnesses too frightened to come forward. This incomplete reckoning left a haunting question mark over the full extent of Gaspipe's crimes. Yet, the documented murders stand as undeniable proof of a reign defined by bloodshed. Each case tells a story of a life cut short, a brutal act of power, and a chilling reminder of the dangers inherent in a world ruled by fear and violence. Law enforcement's efforts to piece together this deadly puzzle involved painstaking detective work, informant testimonies, and the courageous defiance of those willing to break the silence. In examining this brutal ledger, it becomes clear that Anthony Gaspipe Casso was more than a killer. He was an embodiment of the darkest impulses of organized crime. His body count was a grim measure of his success and his ruthlessness, a narrative written in violence that left a permanent imprint on New York's criminal landscape. It is a stark reminder that behind every number lies a human story of loss, pain, and the enduring quest for justice in the face of unimaginable brutality. Chapter 23: Gaspipe's Code. Twisted Loyalty. In the brutal underworld ruled by Anthony Gaspipe Casso, loyalty was a currency far more volatile than gold. It was a fragile, shifting force, one that demanded absolute submission but was continually tested by paranoia, violence, and the insatiable thirst for power. To understand Gaspipe's lethal rise and terrifying reign, one must look beyond the cold facts of his murders and betrayals and into the warped moral compass that guided his every move. This was a code where loyalty was not sacred but transactional, where betrayal was not a sin but a tool of survival. It was a code unlike any other, a twisted, brutal logic that made Casso so deadly. From the outset, Gaspipe's understanding of loyalty was starkly pragmatic. Raised amidst the violent streets of Brooklyn, immersed in a world where allegiance could mean life or death, he quickly learned that loyalty was not an unconditional virtue. Instead, it was a bargaining chip, wielded to protect oneself, to climb the ruthless ladder of the mafia, and to maintain power in a landscape riddled with threats from all sides. To Casso, loyalty was a means to an end, a fortress built on fear rather than trust. Unlike the romanticized notion of the mafia as a brotherhood bound by honor and lifelong commitment, Casso's reality was far grimmer. His loyalty was fiercely personal and intensely self-serving. It extended only as far as it benefited him or his ambitions. Men who pledged allegiance were constantly tested. Suspicion was a constant companion, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. This toxic environment bred an atmosphere where no one felt truly safe. Even the most trusted allies were subject to scrutiny and swift, brutal consequences. Gaspipe's personal relationships were shaped by this cruel calculus. He cultivated alliances when necessary, but remained vigilant for any sign of weakness or treachery. Friends became expendable. Family ties were fragile at best. This cold assessment allowed him to survive countless power struggles, but exacted a heavy toll on his humanity. The ability to trust, to connect on any meaningful level, was sacrificed on the altar of survival and dominance. Betrayal, in Gaspipe's twisted code, was not just tolerated, it was expected. It became a survival strategy, a weapon to be used, before others could use it against him. Preemptive strikes, informants turned double agents, and the ruthless elimination of potential threats defined his leadership style. Paranoia was not a weakness, but a necessity in his world. To hesitate was to invite death. This mentality permeated the Lucchese family under his influence, where soldiers lived in constant fear of the next loyalty test that might seal their fate. Casso's notion of loyalty also distorted the concept of justice within the mafia. Punishments were swift and often disproportionate, designed to send a message that loyalty was not just expected but demanded with lethal seriousness. Acts perceived as disloyal, no matter how minor, were met with violence and often murder. This created a culture of fear where obedience was bought with terror and dissent was crushed before it could take root. Yet, paradoxically, this brutal regime of loyalty and betrayal was effective in maintaining control. Gaspipe's merciless enforcement kept the Lucchese family's ranks disciplined and aligned with his vision. His reputation alone served as a deterrent. The mere whisper of displeasing Gaspipe could trigger deadly consequences. This fear-based loyalty ensured a level of obedience unmatched in the mafia's history, but it also sowed the seeds of eventual dissent and collapse. Examining Gaspipe's code also requires understanding his complex relationship with power. Loyalty was less about personal bonds and more about consolidating and expanding influence. Every alliance, every act of brutality, was calculated to reinforce his position and intimidate rivals. His concept of loyalty was an extension of his hunger for control, a tool to secure dominance and to silence opposition permanently. Moreover, Gaspipe's moral compass was further warped by a profound sense of self-preservation and nihilism. The violent world he inhabited offered no guarantees, no redemption. Trust was dangerous, weakness fatal. This worldview hardened him, making him impervious to appeals to conscience or mercy. He was a man who had accepted the ruthless logic of survival at any cost and wielded it with lethal precision. His actions illustrate this code vividly. Close associates were betrayed in cold blood if their loyalty faltered or they became liabilities. Family members were not spared if they posed threats. Even his partnership with Vittorio Amuso, forged in blood and ambition, was marked by mutual suspicion and calculated moves to protect individual power. The constant tension between alliance and betrayal defined every relationship, every decision. Gaspipe's code also extended beyond his immediate circle to his dealings with the wider mafia network and law enforcement. Corruption was normalized, and betrayal was institutionalized. Informants and double agents were tools to be manipulated. No one was truly exempt from suspicion. This pervasive distrust weakened traditional mafia structures and contributed to the eventual unraveling of the organization's cohesion. Importantly, Gaspipe's twisted loyalty had devastating effects on those caught in his orbit. Soldiers lived in fear, constantly walking a tightrope of obedience and survival. Innocents were collateral damage, sacrificed for power plays and paranoia. Families were torn apart by suspicion and violence. The human cost of this code was immense and lasting, underscoring the brutal reality beneath the mafia's veneer of order and tradition. In reflecting on Gaspipe's code, it becomes clear that his lethal nature was not simply a product of violence, but of a deeply distorted ethics, an inversion of loyalty and betrayal that made him uniquely dangerous. His legacy is a stark reminder that in the world of organized crime, moral boundaries blur, and survival often demands the unthinkable. This chapter seeks to unravel the complex, often contradictory nature of loyalty under Gaspipe's rule. Loyalty shaped by fear, betrayal, and power. It challenges simplistic narratives of good and evil, revealing instead a world where trust is a weapon, betrayal a strategy, and loyalty a twisted code that defines life and death. Chapter 24. Death of a Devil. In the vast, shadowy world of organized crime, few figures loomed as large or as terrifying as Anthony Gaspipe Casso. His name alone conjured images of brutal executions, cold-blooded betrayal, and an unrelenting reign of terror. Yet, as the world moved into the uncertain and unprecedented landscape of 2020, a year that would be marked by a global pandemic, the legend of Gaspipe came to a stark, unceremonious end. Far from the dark alleys and smoky backrooms where he once ruled with iron-fisted brutality, Casso's final moments were spent isolated, confined, and ultimately forgotten. Casso's death from complications related to COVID-19 while serving a life sentence in federal prison was a grim and fitting conclusion to a life defined by violence and treachery. Unlike the cinematic demise that crime folklore often imagines for men of his stature, daring escapes, bloody vendettas, or dramatic assassinations, Gaspipe's final chapter was muted, a quiet fade into the shadows, devoid of the respect or loyalty he once commanded. He died hated, alone, and abandoned by the very world that had once feared and revered him. The man who once wielded power with devastating efficiency found himself powerless in the sterile environment of a prison hospital. The virus, invisible and indifferent, showed no respect for his legacy or past ruthlessness. It attacked a body worn down by years of incarceration, stripping away the layers of fearsome reputation and leaving only a frail, vulnerable figure. The cruel irony was not lost on observers. A man who had once orchestrated violence with a callous flick of the wrist could not overcome an illness that spared no one, regardless of rank or notoriety. The prison system in which Casso spent his final years was ill-prepared for the onslaught of the pandemic. Overcrowded facilities, limited medical resources, and the rapid spread of the virus created a deadly environment for inmates nationwide. For Casso, the conditions exacerbated a dire situation, accelerating his decline. The same walls that had confined him for decades became the backdrop to his last moments, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from the heights of mob dominance. Throughout his incarceration, Casso's infamy never diminished. His cooperation with federal authorities, which had initially seemed like a betrayal to many in the mob world, ensured that he was reviled by former associates and enemies alike. The mafia's code of silence, or omerta, was unforgiving to informants, and Casso had shattered it with a recklessness that alienated him completely. His legacy, therefore, was not just one of fear and power, but of ignominy and isolation. As the pandemic tightened its grip, the usual network of connections and influence that some inmates might rely on was severed. Visits were curtailed, communications restricted, and Casso found himself cut off from the outside world. The allies he might have once depended on were distant memories, replaced by an overwhelming sense of abandonment. In those final days, there was no one to mourn his suffering or offer comfort, a poignant counterpoint to the loyalists who had once obeyed his every command. The death of Gaspipe also marked the end of an era in organized crime history. His life story, marked by savage ambition and brutal enforcement, epitomized a period when fear was currency and power was maintained through violence. Yet, with his passing, the Mafia faced a reckoning, an acknowledgement that the era of unchecked brutality was giving way to new realities. Law enforcement's relentless pursuit, changes within the criminal landscape, and society's evolving response to organized crime had irreversibly altered the game. Reflecting on Casso's death offers a sobering perspective on the cost of a life dedicated to violence and domination. The man who had once been a figure of dread and respect ended his days without dignity or peace. His story is a stark testament to the impermanence of power and the isolating consequences of a path forged through fear and betrayal. In the final analysis, Gaspipe's death from COVID-19 complications is emblematic of a larger truth. No matter the depths of one's brutality or the heights of one's notoriety, mortality remains the ultimate equalizer. The world that once trembled that his name had moved on, leaving behind only a legacy of terror and a cautionary tale about the price of a life lived on the edge of darkness. Chapter 25. The Legacy of Gaspipe Casso. Anthony Gaspipe Casso was a man who embodied the darkest extremes of organized crime, a figure both feared and reviled, whose name became synonymous with violence, betrayal, and destruction. His rise through the ranks of the Mafia was not merely a personal ascent, but a reflection of the ruthless forces at play within the criminal underworld. Yet, his fall was equally significant, marking a profound turning point in the history of the Mafia. In the end, Gaspipe was more than just a killer or an enforcer. He was a monster forged by the mob itself, a creature who, through his own monstrous actions, contributed to its unraveling from within. The story of Gaspipe Casso is not simply one of individual infamy. It is the narrative of a system that bred violence and paranoia, a culture that rewarded brutality and demanded absolute loyalty, but ultimately devoured its own children. Casso's life and legacy force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the Mafia's internal dynamics, the corrosive effects of unchecked power, and the devastating human cost borne by all involved. From his earliest days in Brooklyn, immersed in a world where crime was family business, Casso was shaped by an environment that valorized strength and instilled fear as a tool of control. But unlike many who might have risen through the ranks with a code of honor, Casso's moral compass was fractured and twisted. He saw loyalty as a currency to be bought and sold, betrayal as an inevitable tactic in the endless game of survival. This distorted worldview allowed him to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty, often against those closest to him. Casso's reign of terror devastated the Lucchese family and sent shockwaves throughout the entire Mafia network. His merciless enforcement, his willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way, and his embrace of corruption and manipulation left a trail of broken lives and shattered alliances. The fear he wielded was absolute, but it came at a cost, sowing distrust so deep that even his most loyal associates began to turn against him. The damage Casso inflicted extended beyond immediate violence. He eroded the fragile bonds that held the Mafia together, turning once cohesive families into fractured, paranoid factions. The Code of Omerta, the solemn vow of silence that was the Mafia's cornerstone, was broken under his watch, both by his own betrayal of secrecy and by the ripple effects of fear and suspicion. Informants multiplied, alliances shattered, the insular world of the mob began to crack. Perhaps most tragically, Casso's eventual cooperation with law enforcement, his decision to become a government witness, symbolized the death knell of the old Mafia order. Once the embodiment of Omerta's unbreakable loyalty, his defection underscored how far the Mafia had fallen into chaos and self-destruction. It was a bitter irony that a man who once terrorized entire families would contribute to the conviction and imprisonment of dozens of mobsters, exposing secrets that the organization had fought to keep hidden for decades. That Casso's cooperation did not come from redemption or remorse, but from survival and calculation. Still, it left an indelible mark on the Mafia's structure and psyche. His testimony helped dismantle powerful factions, weakening the grip of organized crime on various enterprises and law enforcement institutions. The once impenetrable veil of silence was pierced, forever altering the balance of power. Yet, even as his actions dismantled parts of the mob, Casso's legacy remains complex and paradoxical. He was both a destroyer and a product of the violent ecosystem that created him. His brutal methods exemplified the darkest consequences of the mafia's culture, a world where might ruled and morality was subordinate to ambition. The very system that empowered him also paved the way for his downfall, consumed by the unchecked brutality it unleashed. His life is a cautionary tale about the perils of absolute power unmoored from conscience. It reminds us that monstrous deeds cannot build lasting empires. Instead, they sow seeds of destruction that inevitably turn inward. The mafia that Gaspipe helped build was, in many ways, a house of cards, vulnerable to collapse under its own weight. The human cost of his reign is immeasurable. Scores of lives lost to violence, families torn apart, and a legacy of fear that haunted survivors for decades. Yet, beyond the headlines of murders and betrayals, there is a deeper story of the consequences of living by a code that elevates power over humanity, loyalty over love, and violence over peace. In the years following Casso's fall, the mafia faced new challenges, shifting criminal enterprises, intensified law enforcement efforts, and changing cultural tides. The era of Gaspipe's reign now exists largely in memory and cautionary study, a dark chapter illustrating the destructive potential of unchecked ambition and cruelty. Looking back, his story challenges romanticized notions of the mafia as a brotherhood bound by honor. Instead, it exposes a brutal reality of internal warfare, shifting allegiances, and moral decay. Gaspipe Casso was not an aberration. He was an extreme manifestation of the forces at play within organized crime, a man whose legacy is inseparable from the violence and betrayal that defined that world. Ultimately, the legacy of Anthony Gaspipe Casso is a mirror held up to the mafia itself, a reflection of its capacity for both power and ruin. His rise and fall underscore the dangers inherent in a life lived in shadows and blood, a life where the thirst for control eclipses all else. And as the underworld moves forward, grappling with its past, the story of Gaspipe remains a stark warning. Monsters created by their own making may be the ones who destroy from within.